Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. It wasn't the first time the drawer was left ajar. The papers inside occasionally shifted like they had been searched, but I rarely paid attention. The afternoon sun crept through the blinds, highlighting the dust motes that danced in the air like whispers. The coffee tasted slightly bitter, but that was nothing new. I bought a different brand last week. I noticed the rug was askew, not aligned with the floorboards. I straightened it without thinking. When I locked up for the night, I left the drawer as I found it. The understanding came to me gradually, the way water seeps through fabric. Something had already begun long before I recognized it. The certainty settled in my chest like a stone, heavy and undeniable. I had been watched, studied, catalogued in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. When did the suspicion first take root? I find myself returning to that question, circling it like a moth drawn to flame. Perhaps it began with the way she held her coffee cup, fingers wrapped around the ceramic as if protecting something precious. Or maybe it was earlier in the pause between her question and my answer, a hesitation so brief I almost missed it. The mind plays tricks when you're searching for patterns. Everything becomes significant. Everything becomes suspect. The office felt different after the holidays. Not emptier exactly, but rearranged in subtle ways that suggested someone had been there during the quiet weeks. Files reorganized with a precision that wasn't mine. The plant by the window had been watered, its leaves greener than I remembered. Small kindnesses that felt like violations. I began keeping track of things. Not obsessively, I told myself, just carefully. The position of my chair when I arrived each morning, the angle of the desk lamp, the way my pens were arranged in their holder, innocent details that accumulated weight through repetition. The human mind craves order, seeks meaning in the mundane. Sometimes that search becomes its own kind of madness. She mentioned her weekend plans with the same casual tone she used to discuss the weather. A trip to the coast, she said, somewhere quiet where she could think. The way she emphasized think made me wonder what required such solitude. Her fingers drummed against the desk as she spoke, a rhythm I found myself humming later without realizing why. The photographs in her desk drawer weren't hidden exactly, just tucked beneath other papers as if their importance was meant to be discovered rather than displayed. Vacation pictures mostly, beaches and boardwalks, faces I didn't recognize wearing smiles that seemed genuine. But there was something in her expression in each image, a distance that suggested her thoughts were elsewhere. I studied those pictures longer than I should have, searching for clues to questions I couldn't articulate. Memory is unreliable, I know this. It reshapes itself each time we access it, adding details that feel authentic but may be entirely fabricated. The conversation we had about trust, for instance. Did she really pause before answering my question about her previous job, or have I invented that hesitation? The coffee shop where we met to discuss the project, was the barista really watching us with unusual interest, or am I retrofitting suspicion onto an innocent moment? The receipts in her purse told a story I wasn't sure I wanted to read. Gas stations along coastal highways, restaurants in small towns I'd never heard of, a hardware store purchase that included rope and plastic sheeting. Reasonable explanations existed for everything, of course. A camping trip, home repairs, the innocent accumulation of a life lived normally. But innocence and normalcy had begun to feel like carefully constructed facades. I started following her, though I prefer to think of it as parallel journeys. The same routes, the same destinations, separated by time and intention. The library where she spent her afternoons researching topics I could only glimpse from a distance. The The park where she sat alone on the same bench, always facing the water. The storage facility on the outskirts of town where she visited with clockwork regularity. The key I found in my desk drawer didn't belong to any lock I recognized. Small and silver, worn smooth by handling. It appeared the same day she mentioned needing space to sort through some personal matters. Coincidences layer themselves into patterns when you're predisposed to see connections. The key felt warm in my palm, as if recently held by someone else. Her stories about her childhood shifted with each telling. The house where she grew up gained and lost rooms. Siblings appeared and disappeared from her narratives. The town changed names, moved between states, existed in a geography that seemed to shift with her mood. I began keeping notes, trying to map the contradictions, but the inconsistencies multiplied faster than I could catalog them. The storage unit was easier to access than it should have been. The lock was old, the kind that yields to patience rather than expertise. Inside, boxes labeled in her careful handwriting contained the archaeology of multiple lives, driver's licenses with different names but the same photograph, credit cards that told stories of purchases in places she claimed never to have visited, a collection of identities organized with the precision of a filing system. I understood then that I had been chosen for reasons I was only beginning to grasp. The job interview where we first met, the project that brought us together, the gradual intimacy of shared work, all of it carefully orchestrated. I was part of something larger, though my role remained unclear. A witness, perhaps, or something more complicated. The photographs made more sense now, not vacation pictures, but documentation. Evidence of successful disappearances, clean breaks from lives that had become inconvenient. She moved through identities like changing clothes, leaving behind versions of herself with the ease of someone who had perfected the art of erasure. The coastal trips weren't recreational, they were practical. Bodies of water offer certain advantages for those seeking permanent solutions to temporary problems. The hardware store purchases aligned with this understanding. Weights and wrapping, the tools of disposal refined through repetition. I found myself admiring the efficiency even as it horrified me. But doubt crept in as I examined the evidence more closely. The licenses could be forgeries, the credit cards stolen, the photographs staged. Perhaps I was seeing conspiracy where only coincidence existed. The mind that seeks patterns will find them everywhere, even in randomness, especially in randomness. I confronted her on a Tuesday, though the day itself seems less important now than the quality of light filtering through the office windows. She listened to my accusations with the patience of someone who had been expecting this conversation. Her responses were measured, reasonable. Alternative explanations for everything I had discovered, evidence of my own paranoia rather than her deception. The storage unit, she explained, belonged to her sister, who had asked her to clean it out after a difficult divorce. The multiple identities were props for a theater group she had belonged to years ago. The coastal trips were exactly what she had always claimed, opportunities for solitude and reflection. Each mystery dissolved under the pressure of mundane explanation. I wanted to believe her. The alternative was too disturbing, too complicated for the simple life I had been living. But belief and knowledge are different creatures, and something in her eyes suggested truths that her words didn't acknowledge. The pause before each answer, the way her hands remained perfectly still as she spoke, the careful modulation of her voice that suggested rehearsal. The drawer remains ajar. I no longer straighten the rug or notice the position of my chair. The key disappeared from my desk the same day we had our conversation, though I never mentioned finding it. The coffee tastes different now, though I've returned to my usual brand. Small changes accumulate into larger uncertainties. She transferred to another department the following week. A promotion, she said, an opportunity too good to refuse. We exchange pleasantries when our paths cross in the hallway, conversations that feel scripted in their casualness. She asks about my weekend plans with genuine interest. I tell her about books I'm reading, movies I've seen. We maintain the fiction of normalcy with the dedication of method actors. But I've begun noticing things again. The way new employees seem to find reasons to visit my office. The questions about my routines, my habits, my plans. The careful attention to details that once felt like friendship but now carries the weight of surveillance. Perhaps I was never the investigator in this story. Perhaps I was always the subject. The papers in the drawer shift position with increasing frequency now. Documents I don't remember filing appear among my personal effects. Photographs of places I've never been, people I've never met, moments that feel familiar despite their impossibility. The evidence of a life I might have lived or might yet live, depending on decisions I haven't consciously made. I find myself researching coastal towns, storage facilities, hardware stores, not for any specific purpose, just curiosity about the practical aspects of disappearance. How easy it would be to shed this identity, this routine, this increasingly uncomfortable awareness of being observed. The internet offers detailed instructions for those seeking new beginnings. The process is more straightforward than I had imagined. The afternoon sun still creeps through the blinds, but the dust motes no longer dance like whispers. They hang in the air with purpose now, each particle a small witness to the gradual transformation of everything I thought I understood. The drawer waits, patient and knowing, its contents shifting like sediment in a slow-moving current. I leave it ajar when I lock up for the night. Some mysteries are meant to deepen rather than resolve. Some drawers are meant to remain open, their secrets breathing in the darkness, waiting for the next person to notice what has been carefully left for them to find. Story 2. Every morning, without fail, a single leaf from the old oak would land on my doorstep. I used to brush it aside, assuming it was just the wind playing its tricks. The leaves were always the same shape, same color, arriving as though delivered with purpose. At first, they came with the morning newspaper, nestled innocently in the folds like a routine greeting. But then last week, the leaf was dry and brittle, crumbling at a touch unlike the others. This morning, the leaf didn't appear at all. Instead, the newspaper lay askew, as if hesitant to settle. I stood there in my bathrobe, the concrete cold beneath my bare feet, staring at the empty space where the leaf should have been. The absence felt heavier than its presence ever had. The morning air carried the scent of dew and something else, something metallic that made my throat tighten. The oak tree loomed across the street, its branches swaying gently in the breeze, yet no leaves fell. I watched for several minutes, counting the seconds between each gust of wind, waiting for that familiar flutter of green to detach and drift toward my door. Nothing came. I picked up the newspaper, noting how it had been folded differently than usual. The delivery person had always creased it the same way, a neat rectangle that fit perfectly into the slot of my screen door. Today it was loose, uneven, as though someone had opened it and tried unsuccessfully to restore its original form. The headline spoke of a missing person case, a woman who had vanished from her home while her family slept. The photograph showed a face I thought I recognized, though I couldn't place where I might have seen her. Her eyes seemed to follow me as I carried the paper inside, that uncomfortable sensation of being observed even through newsprint. I made coffee, the familiar ritual providing some comfort against the morning's strangeness. The kitchen window offered a clear view of the oak tree, and I found myself glancing at it repeatedly as I waited for the coffee to brew. The trunk was thick, scarred with initials and marks that spoke of decades of neighborhood children claiming their territory. The coffee tasted different, bitter in a way that seemed to coat my tongue and linger long after I swallowed. I poured it down the sink and started a fresh pot, checking the expiration date on the cream, sniffing the sugar for any sign of contamination. Everything appeared normal, yet the second cup carried the same unpleasant aftertaste. My neighbor emerged from her house, moving with the careful deliberation of someone much older than her apparent age. She wore the same blue cardigan she'd worn every morning for months, but today she paused at the end of her driveway, looking directly at my window. When our eyes met, she didn't wave or nod as she usually did. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as though studying something she couldn't quite understand. I watched her walk to her mailbox, noting how she glanced repeatedly at the oak tree. She reached inside the metal box and withdrew what appeared to be a single envelope, but she didn't open it immediately. Instead, she held it to her chest and looked back at my house. Her expression was unreadable from this distance, but something in her posture suggested fear. The telephone rang, startling me from my observation. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, a woman speaking in measured tones about a survey regarding neighborhood safety. She asked if I had noticed anything unusual recently, any changes in routine or behavior that might concern a resident. I found myself mentioning the leaf, though I couldn't explain why this detail seemed relevant to a safety survey. The woman on the phone was quiet for a long moment after I described the morning ritual that had suddenly ceased. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, more personal than professional. She asked if I had lived in the house long, if I knew the previous residents, if I had ever found anything else on my doorstep besides leaves and newspapers. I told her about the package that had arrived several months ago, addressed to someone I didn't know. The return address had been smudged, illegible, and the contents had been strange. A small wooden box containing what appeared to be pressed flowers and a photograph of the oak tree taken from an angle I couldn't identify. I had assumed it was a mistake, a delivery meant for a previous tenant, and had left it on the kitchen counter until I could decide what to do with it. The surveyor asked if I still had the package. I realized I hadn't thought about it in weeks, couldn't remember the last time I had seen it. I told her I would check and call her back, but when I asked for her number, she said she would contact me again if necessary and hung up. The kitchen counter was clear except for the usual items. I searched the drawers, the cabinets, even the refrigerator, thinking I might have moved the package absently during one of my cleaning sessions. It was nowhere to be found, yet I had no memory of throwing it away or moving it elsewhere. I returned to the window, seeking the comfort of routine observation. The neighbor was gone, but her mailbox remained open, swinging slightly in the breeze. The envelope lay on the ground beside it, white against the dark asphalt. I watched it for several minutes, waiting for her to return and retrieve it, but the street remained empty. The urge to cross the street and examine the envelope grew stronger as the morning progressed. I told myself it was simple neighborly concern, that she might have dropped it accidentally and would be grateful for its return. But something deeper drove my curiosity, a connection I couldn't articulate between the missing leaf, the strange phone call, and that discarded piece of mail. I dressed quickly and walked across the street, my footsteps echoing louder than they should have in the morning stillness. The envelope was heavier than expected, thick with multiple pages or perhaps a photograph. My name was written on it in careful script, not my neighbor's name as I had assumed from the distance. The return address was local, a street I recognized but couldn't place precisely. Inside were 3 photographs of my house taken from different angles, each showing the front door with a single leaf positioned on the doorstep. The leaves in the photographs were identical to the ones I had been finding each morning, but the images had been taken at night, the porch light casting strange shadows that made familiar shapes appear threatening. A note was tucked behind the photographs, written in the same careful handwriting as the envelope. It asked if I had enjoyed the daily gifts, if I had understood their significance, if I was ready to learn the truth about what had happened to the previous tenant. The writer claimed to have been watching, waiting for the right moment to make contact, studying my reactions to determine whether I could be trusted with information about a crime that had never been reported. I looked back at my house, seeing it suddenly as others might see it, as a place where someone had lived and disappeared without explanation. The windows seemed darker, the shadows deeper. I wondered who might be watching now, whether my cross to retrieve the envelope had been observed and interpreted as a signal of some kind. The photographs showed details I had never noticed, scratches on the front door that could have been claw marks or deliberate scoring. A stain on the concrete that I had always assumed was from spilled coffee or motor oil, but which now appeared more sinister in the stark black and white imagery. Most disturbing was the final photograph, which showed not just the leaf on my doorstep, but a second figure standing in my living room window, a silhouette I didn't recognize. I had been alone in the house when these photographs were taken. I was certain of this, yet the evidence suggested otherwise. The figure was tall, angular, definitely not my own reflection. It stood in a position that would have been clearly visible to me had I been in any of the other rooms, yet I had no memory of seeing anyone, no awareness of another presence in my home. The metallic smell from the morning grew stronger as I stood in the street, envelope in hand. It seemed to emanate from the photographs themselves, as though the images had captured not just visual information, but olfactory data as well. I thought of the woman in the newspaper, the missing person whose face had seemed familiar. The connection felt important, but remained just beyond my grasp. My neighbor's house showed no signs of life. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn, and no car sat in the driveway. I realized I had never seen a vehicle there, had never witnessed her leaving for work or returning with groceries. Her appearances had been limited to the morning mailbox routine, and now even that seemed questionable. Had she actually lived there, or had she been performing some other purpose in those brief outdoor moments? I walked to her front door and knocked, the sound echoing hollowly as though the house were empty. No footsteps approached, no voice called out in response. I tried the handle and found it unlocked, the door swinging open to reveal a space that clearly hadn't been inhabited recently. Dust covered every surface, and the air held the stale quality of a place sealed away from the world. The blue cardigan hung on a hook near the door, but it was faded and worn, as though it had been hanging there for much longer than the few months I had been seeing it worn. The mailbox key lay on a small table, beside a stack of envelopes all addressed to me, all containing photographs of my house taken at different times and from various angles. Some of the images showed the leaf placement ritual I had grown accustomed to, but others revealed activities I had no memory of. Myself standing in my yard at what appeared to be night, digging in the flower bed. Myself carrying what looked like a large bundle from my back door to the trunk of my car. Myself hosing down my driveway with an intensity that suggested I was cleaning more than just dust and debris. The photographs were dated, though I couldn't understand the system being used. Numbers and letters in combinations that might have represented times and dates, or might have been some kind of code. The handwriting on the backs was different from the note, more hurried, as though these images had been processed quickly and filed for future reference. I sat in the dusty chair by the window, looking across at my own house while trying to process what I had discovered. The morning sun cast everything in sharp relief, making the ordinary suburban street appear somehow theatrical, as though it were a stage set waiting for actors to take their positions and begin a performance I didn't understand. The telephone in the abandoned house began to ring, a sound so unexpected that I nearly dropped the photographs. I stared at the old rotary phone on the kitchen counter, watching it shake with each ring. After several moments, I approached and lifted the receiver. The voice was the same woman who had called about the neighborhood safety survey, but now she spoke with familiarity, as though we had been having an ongoing conversation. She asked if I had found the photographs helpful, if they had clarified the situation or raised additional questions. She wanted to know if I remembered taking them, if the activities they documented seemed familiar or completely foreign. I told her I had no memory of the events shown in the images, that they appeared to document someone else's life entirely. She was quiet for a moment, then asked if I had checked the flower bed recently, if I had noticed whether the soil had been disturbed or if anything unusual had grown there. The flower bed, I realized I had been avoiding that area of my yard, walking around it rather than through it, though I couldn't remember making a conscious decision to do so. The soil was darker there, richer, and the plants grew with an unusual vigor that I had attributed to favorable drainage or sunlight conditions. She asked if I wanted to know what was buried there, or if I preferred to continue living with the uncertainty. Her tone suggested that knowledge would bring its own burden, that some truths were more difficult to bear than ignorance. I found myself unable to answer, caught between the need to understand and the fear of what understanding might cost. The line went quiet, but I could hear breathing on the other end, patient and steady. Outside, a car pulled into my driveway, though I hadn't heard it approach. Through the window of the abandoned house, I watched a figure emerge and walk to my front door. They moved with purpose, carrying what appeared to be a single leaf. I hung up the phone and ran from the house, leaving the photographs scattered on the floor. By the time I reached my own front door, the visitor was gone, but the leaf lay on my doorstep exactly as it had every morning for months, fresh and green, perfectly shaped, as though it had just fallen from the tree. But the oak tree across the street was bare now, its branches stripped of foliage by a wind I hadn't noticed. The leaf on my doorstep couldn't have come from there, couldn't have come from anywhere in the immediate vicinity. Yet there it was, placed with the same careful precision I had grown to expect. I picked up the leaf and examined it closely. It was warm to the touch and carried a scent that was both familiar and troubling. Not the clean smell of growing things, but something more complex, more personal. It reminded me of someone, though I couldn't place who or when I might have encountered this particular fragrance. The newspaper was gone from where I had left it, though I had no memory of bringing it inside. In its place was a small wooden box, identical to the one I had received months earlier and subsequently lost. Inside were the same pressed flowers, the same photograph of the oak tree, but now there was an additional item. A key that fit perfectly in my hand, as though it had been made specifically for my grip. I knew without testing it that this key would open something important, would provide access to information I both needed and dreaded. The weight of it seemed disproportionate to its size, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to face. Yet I found myself walking toward my house, toward whatever lock this key was meant to open. The basement door had always been locked, though I had never questioned why or sought to explore what lay beyond it. I had assumed it contained the usual basement items, a water heater, storage boxes, perhaps some tools left by previous owners. The key slid into the lock as though returning home. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step taking me deeper into a space that smelled of earth and something else, something that made the metallic taste return to my mouth. At the bottom, A single bulb cast weak light over a room that was both exactly what I expected and completely wrong. There were storage boxes, but they contained photographs of people I didn't recognize, all taken with the same careful composition as the images of my house. There were tools, but they were clean and organized in a way that suggested recent and regular use. And there was a journal, bound in leather and filled with handwriting I slowly recognized as my own. The entries described a routine I had no memory of maintaining. Daily observations of neighbors, detailed notes about their schedules and habits, plans for activities that seemed to involve the careful placement of objects and the documentation of responses. The leaf ritual was mentioned frequently, described as a test of awareness and reaction. According to the journal, I had been watching the previous tenant of my house long before I moved in. I had studied her routines, learned her vulnerabilities, gained her trust through a careful campaign of small kindnesses and apparent coincidences. The entries described her disappearance not as a mystery, but as a successful completion of a long-term project. But I had no memory of writing these words, no recollection of the person described in these pages. The handwriting was mine, the details too specific to be fabrication, yet they documented a life I couldn't accept as my own. I read entry after entry, each one pulling me deeper into a version of myself I didn't recognize. The final entry was dated recently, describing my own arrival in the house and the beginning of a new cycle. It mentioned the neighbor in the blue cardigan as a useful tool for observation, a way to monitor my adjustment to the new environment and my reaction to the daily leaf placement. It described her as cooperative but ultimately disposable, someone whose usefulness had ended with the completion of her surveillance role. I climbed the stairs slowly, the journal clutched in my hands, my mind struggling to reconcile the evidence with my sense of self. The morning sun seemed harsher now, casting shadows that appeared to move independently of their sources. The street looked the same, but I saw it differently, as though I were viewing it through someone else's eyes. The leaf on my doorstep had wilted while I was in the basement, its edges curling and darkening despite the brief passage of time. I picked it up and watched it crumble between my fingers, the fragments scattering in a breeze that carried them back toward the bare oak tree. I looked at my reflection in the front window, searching for some sign of the person described in the journal, some indication that I was capable of the activities documented in those careful entries. The face that looked back was familiar but somehow changed, as though I were seeing it clearly for the first time. The telephone inside began to ring again, but I made no move to answer it. I knew who would be calling, knew what questions would be asked, knew that my answers would reveal more than I was prepared to accept. Instead, I sat on my front step, watching the empty street and waiting for the next leaf to appear. But deep down, I suspected I already knew where it would come from. Story 3. I stood by the window, transfixed by the picture frame on the mantelpiece, which leaned forward ever so slightly. Within the dim room, shadows played games, each settling in positions that felt half familiar, yet distinctly wrong. The air around me seemed to hold its breath, and the typically comforting tick from the wall clock was absent, leaving an uncomfortable void. Each creak of the old floors felt louder, a reminder of what was silently amiss. My eyes darted back to the frame, noticing a new detail, the dust-free edge on the surface where it had shifted, a silent testimony to movement I never saw. The nausea rises like brackish water, filling my throat with something metallic and wrong. I've been carrying this feeling for days now, maybe weeks. Time has become elastic, stretching and contracting without my permission. The sensation sits in my stomach like a stone, cold and immovable, radiating outward until even my fingertips feel numb. I remember her hands first, always her hands. They moved with such deliberate precision, arranging things just so. The way she'd straighten that same picture frame, running her finger along its edge to check for dust. She was particular about dust, obsessive really, but that's not quite right either. Memory is a liar, dressing up fragments in clothes that don't quite fit. The room feels smaller now, as if the walls have been creeping inward while I wasn't paying attention. This happens sometimes. Spaces contract around me like a fist closing. I know I should leave, step outside, breathe fresh air, but my legs feel disconnected from my intentions. They belong to someone else, someone who wants to stay and stare at that crooked frame. She used to say the house had moods. I thought it was charming then, the way she'd speak about the building as if it were alive. "The house is restless tonight," she'd whisper, and I'd pull her closer, thinking it was romantic nonsense. But houses do have moods, don't they? This one feels guilty. The memory surfaces without warning, her face in the bathroom mirror, but wrong somehow. The reflection didn't match the angle of her head. I was standing behind her, watching her brush her teeth, and the mirror showed her looking directly at me while her actual face remained focused downward. Impossible, of course. Mirrors don't lie, people do. My hands are shaking now, a fine tremor that makes the room seem to vibrate. I press my palms against the windowsill, feeling the paint flake away under pressure. Everything here is deteriorating, falling apart in microscopic increments, like trust, like memory, like the story I've been telling myself about what happened that night. That night, but which night, they blur together now, a smear of darkness punctuated by fragments that might be real or might be dreams. I remember the sound of water running, always water running. She loved long baths, would disappear for hours while I waited downstairs, listening to the pipes sing their hollow songs. The sound became a metronome for my anxiety. But the water stopped eventually. It always stopped. The frame tilts further forward as I watch, defying physics or reason. Objects don't move on their own, yet here it is, shifting like a slow-motion fall. I should reach out and straighten it, but my arms feel heavy as lead. Instead, I study the photograph inside, two figures standing close together, faces obscured by shadow and poor lighting. I can't remember when it was taken or why we kept it. The composition is wrong, the subjects awkwardly positioned, as if they were trying to avoid something just outside the camera's range. My reflection in the window glass superimposes itself over the yard beyond, creating a double exposure that makes me dizzy. I see my face overlaid on the garden where she used to plant roses. The roses are gone now, replaced by bare patches of earth that look suspiciously like graves. But that's paranoia talking. Gardens die without care. Plants wither. People leave. People leave. The phrase echoes in my skull, bouncing off the walls of my consciousness like a moth against a lampshade. She left. That's the simple truth, the one I should cling to. She packed her bags. No, she didn't pack her bags. Her clothes remained in the closet for weeks after, hanging like empty promises. I would stand among them sometimes, breathing in the fading scent of her perfume, trying to understand how someone could vanish so completely while leaving everything behind. The social worker had kind eyes but firm questions. She sat in the chair where my wife used to read, taking notes in a leather portfolio that made soft, scratching sounds against her lap. "When did you last see her?" she asked, and I opened my mouth to answer but found only silence. When had I last seen her? Really seen her, not just the shape of her moving through rooms like a ghost already half departed. I told the social worker about the morning routine. Coffee at 7, toast cut diagonally, the newspaper folded just so. I described these details with the precision of a court stenographer, but even as I spoke, I knew something was wrong with the timeline. The newspaper had been discontinued months earlier. The coffee maker had been broken since spring. Yet I could taste the bitter brew on my tongue, could see the crumbs scattered across the kitchen table like evidence of a life that might never have existed. The walls are breathing now, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that matches my pulse. This room has become a lung, and I'm trapped inside its suffocating embrace. The air tastes stale, recycled, as if it's been trapped here as long as I have. How long have I been standing at this window? Minutes, hours. The absent clock offers no answers, its silence more oppressive than any ticking could ever be. I remember the detective's visit, though it feels like something that happened to someone else. He was younger than I expected, with nervous energy that made him pace while he talked. He asked about her habits, her friends, her state of mind. I answered as best I could, but my responses felt rehearsed, as if I'd been practicing them for years. She was happy, I heard myself say, though I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen her smile. Not really smile, with her eyes involved. Her mouth had continued making the right shapes, but the light behind her expression had dimmed gradually, like a bulb burning out so slowly you don't notice until you're sitting in darkness. The photograph in the tilting frame seems to shift when I'm not looking directly at it. Peripheral vision catches movement that disappears under direct scrutiny. The two figures in the image appear closer together now, or perhaps farther apart. Distance becomes meaningless when you're dealing with shadows and poor lighting. I wonder who took the picture. Neither of us had friends who visited regularly. We'd become insular, feeding off each other's presence until the outside world felt foreign and unnecessary. Isolation breeds strange thoughts, conspiracy theories of the mundane. I began to suspect the mailman of reading our correspondence, though we rarely received anything more interesting than utility bills. The neighbor's dog seemed to bark in code, delivering messages I couldn't decipher but felt certain were about us, about her, about what I might have done or failed to do. My reflection in the window glass fractures as clouds pass overhead, breaking my face into geometric fragments. I look like a cubist portrait, all angles and displaced features. This feels appropriate somehow. I haven't felt like a whole person since she disappeared. Parts of me went missing too, scattered like breadcrumbs on a path I can't retrace. The social worker mentioned counseling. Grief counseling, she called it, though I hadn't told her I was grieving. Missing someone isn't the same as mourning them, is it? Grief implies finality, acceptance of loss. I wasn't ready for that level of surrender. I preferred the liminal space of uncertainty, where she might still be coming home, might still walk through the door with an explanation that would make everything make sense again. But doors don't open on their own any more than picture frames move without cause. The house has been holding its breath for so long now that I've forgotten what normal sounds like. The absence of her footsteps has become its own kind of presence, a negative space shaped like all the places she used to be. I remember the bathtub overflowing, water cascading over the edge like a domestic waterfall, soaking through the floorboards until the ceiling below began to stain. I found her there but not there, present but absent. Her eyes were open but looking at something I couldn't see, something beyond the bathroom walls, beyond the house, beyond me. The water was still warm, which meant it had happened recently. But what had happened? She was breathing. Her heart was beating. All the vital signs of life were present, yet something essential had already departed. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and despair. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the persistence of mechanical insects. She lay in the narrow bed, connected to machines that beeped and whirred with electronic concern. The doctors used words like catatonic and dissociative, clinical terms that transformed my wife into a case study. They asked about stressors, trauma, changes in behavior. I nodded and made appropriate sounds, but their questions felt like they were about someone else, some other woman who happened to share her face. But that's not right either. She never went to the hospital. She never had the chance. The water was too deep, too warm, too welcoming. By the time I found her, the machines that might have beeped and whirred were already irrelevant. The doctors with their clinical terms never had the opportunity to reduce her to a case study. She had already reduced herself to something smaller, something that could slip away through the gap between intention and action, between presence and absence. The frame falls forward another degree, defying gravity's patient pull. Soon it will tip past the point of no return and crash to the mantelpiece below, glass shattering into fragments that will reflect the room from 1,000 different angles. Each shard will show a slightly different version of reality, and I'll have to choose which reflection to believe. This feels like a metaphor for something, but metaphors are just lies dressed up in fancy clothes. My wife was good at metaphors. She could transform the mundane into poetry with a few carefully chosen words. A traffic jam became a meditation on modern life's constraints. A broken appliance became a symbol of planned obsolescence, both mechanical and emotional. She saw connections everywhere, patterns that linked seemingly unrelated events into a grand narrative of meaning and purpose. Perhaps that's why she couldn't handle the meaninglessness when it finally arrived. Some people are built for chaos, can thrive in the absence of structure. Others need their patterns and connections, their sense that everything happens for a reason. When reason abandons the building, they follow it out the door. The detective returned several times, each visit more perfunctory than the last. His initial enthusiasm gave way to resignation as the case grew cold. Missing persons become statistics when there are no leads to follow, no evidence to process, no witnesses to interview. She had simply stepped out of the world as quietly as she had moved through it, leaving behind only questions and a photograph that refused to stay properly positioned. I told him about the water, about finding the bathroom flooded, but my story kept changing in small ways. Sometimes the faucet was running, sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes she was there, sometimes she had already gone. Memory is unreliable when it's been filtered through trauma and guilt. Details shift and blur until you're not sure what you actually witnessed versus what you've constructed to fill the gaps. The gaps are important. They're where truth hides, in the spaces between what we remember and what we choose to forget. I've been living in those gaps for so long now that solid ground feels foreign under my feet. The house exists in the gaps too, suspended between occupied and abandoned, between home and crime scene, between sanctuary and prison. My hands have left prints on the windowsill, smudged evidence of my vigil. The glass is fogged with my breath, creating a barrier between inside and outside that feels increasingly impermeable. I could open the window, let fresh air circulate, but that would disturb the careful balance of stagnation I've cultivated. Change feels dangerous when you're clinging to the fragments of something that might never have been whole to begin with. The photograph finally tips past the point of equilibrium, falling forward in slow motion like a tree giving up its fight with the wind. But instead of crashing, it stops, suspended at an impossible angle that defies both gravity and reason. Objects don't behave this way in the real world, which suggests I may have left the real world behind some time ago without noticing the transition. This feels like an important realization, though I'm not sure what to do with it. If this isn't reality, then what is it? Memory, dream, some hybrid space where the rules of physics bend to accommodate psychological necessity. The house has always felt liminal, existing on the border between what is and what might be. Perhaps I've finally crossed that border completely. She would understand this place, I think. She always lived partially in other worlds, in the spaces between words where meaning accumulated like dust in corners. Her absence here feels more real than her presence ever did in the solid world of clocks and calendars. Here, She can exist in the gaps, in the pauses between breaths, in the silence where the ticking used to be. The frame hovers at its impossible angle, neither falling nor returning to its proper position. Like everything else in this house, it exists in suspension, waiting for resolution that may never come. I understand now why the clock stopped ticking. Time has no meaning in a place where cause and effect have been suspended indefinitely. I close my eyes and listen to the house breathing around me, its walls expanding and contracting with the rhythm of something alive but not quite human. When I open them again, the frame has returned to its original position, straight and properly aligned. But the dust-free edge remains, evidence of movement that might have happened or might be yet to come. In the photograph, the two shadowy figures stand exactly where they always have, faces obscured by poor lighting and the passage of time. But now I can see what they're avoiding, what lies just outside the camera's range. It's nothing dramatic or terrible. Just empty space, waiting to be filled by whatever story we choose to tell about what happened next. The story I choose is this: she left because leaving was the only honest thing left to do. The water was just water, the silence just silence, the absence just absence. Sometimes people disappear not because something terrible happened to them, but because something terrible didn't happen, and they couldn't bear the weight of all that accumulated nothing. But stories are just another kind of lie, aren't they? And I've been lying to myself for so long that I've forgotten what truth feels like. The frame leans forward again, ready to fall or fly, or simply remain suspended in the space between possibility and fact. I think I'll let it decide for itself. Story 4. I had wiped the dust from the mantelpiece, the cloth leaving streaks over the polished wood. My fingertips tingled as if brushing against a current of forgotten moments. The air was still, yet carried a peculiar dryness that clung to my throat. My eyes traced the grooves in the floorboards, noticing a faint imprint that hadn't been there before. It felt as though the room held its breath, waiting. Everything appeared unchanged, but something in the air had shifted. The house had been empty for months, yet the dust patterns suggested otherwise. Someone had been here recently, moving carefully through the rooms, disturbing only what was necessary. I crouched beside the mark on the floor, running my fingers along its edges. The wood was slightly raised, as if something heavy had been dragged across it repeatedly. My sister had asked me to check on the property while she sorted through the legal matters. The inheritance had become complicated after our aunt's passing, with questions arising about her final wishes. The family had grown distant over the proceedings, voices raised during phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. The scent of lavender lingered in the hallway, though I couldn't locate its source. Our aunt had favored rose oil, not lavender. I moved through each room methodically, noting the small discrepancies that accumulated like drops of water wearing away stone. A book spine facing the wrong direction on a shelf. A chair positioned at an angle that blocked natural light from the window. Curtains drawn in a room that had always been kept bright. In the kitchen, I found a coffee mug in the sink. The ceramic was cold but showed no signs of having sat there for months. The rim bore a faint lipstick stain in a shade I didn't recognize. My sister wore neutral tones, practical colors that wouldn't draw attention. This was deeper, more deliberate. The refrigerator hummed with an irregular rhythm, occasionally skipping a beat before resuming its steady drone. Inside, I discovered items that shouldn't have been there. Fresh milk, well within its expiration date. A container of yogurt, unopened. Vegetables in the crisper drawer that showed no signs of decay. I called my sister from the kitchen phone, the old rotary model our aunt had refused to replace. The connection crackled with static, making her voice sound distant and distorted. You said the house has been empty since the funeral, I said. It has been, why do you ask? There's fresh food in the refrigerator. Someone's been staying here. The pause stretched longer than seemed natural. When she spoke again, her tone had changed, becoming more measured. Perhaps the cleaning service I hired took some liberties. I'll speak with them about it. I hadn't known about any cleaning service. The house showed signs of occupancy, not professional maintenance. Personal items had been moved, not claimed. The difference was subtle but unmistakable to someone who had spent childhood summers in these rooms. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked under my weight in patterns I remembered from years past. The master bedroom door stood ajar, revealing a slice of afternoon light that fell across the hardwood floor in a perfect rectangle. Inside, the bed was made with military precision, corners tucked and surface smooth. But the pillows showed indentations, as if someone had been lying there recently. The dresser drawers were slightly open, each one pulled out exactly the same distance. I opened them fully, finding our aunt's clothing still folded and arranged as she had left it, except for one drawer which contained items that didn't belong. Men's clothing, expensive but worn, a watch that ticked steadily despite the silence surrounding it. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to piece together what I was seeing. The house felt lived in despite being legally vacant. Someone had been caring for it, maintaining it, perhaps even calling it home. But who had that authority? The phone rang downstairs, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet. I let it ring, counting each cycle until it stopped. Then it began again, persistent and demanding. By the time I reached the kitchen, it had fallen silent. The answering machine blinked with a new message. I pressed play, hearing the whir of the tape rewinding before a voice emerged from the small speaker. It was a man, older, with a careful way of speaking that suggested he was choosing his words deliberately. The arrangement we discussed still stands. I'll continue to maintain the property as agreed. Please don't send anyone else to check on things. It creates complications we both want to avoid. The message ended with a soft click, leaving me staring at the machine. What arrangement? My sister had mentioned nothing about a caretaker or any ongoing agreements. The legal proceedings had been presented as straightforward, a simple matter of transferring ownership and settling debts. I replayed the message, listening for clues in the man's voice. He spoke with familiarity, as if he had been part of our aunt's life in ways the family hadn't known about. His tone carried an intimacy that suggested more than a professional relationship. The basement door stood at the end of the hallway, painted white but showing chips and scratches near the handle. I had avoided it during my initial walk-through, remembering childhood fears of the dark space below. Now it seemed necessary to examine every part of the house. The stairs descended into cool air that smelled of concrete and old wood. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows that shifted as it swayed slightly in an unfelt breeze. The basement had been converted into a workshop, with tools hanging on pegboard walls and a workbench covered in projects in various stages of completion. But it was the corner that drew my attention. A small living space had been created there, separated from the workshop by a hanging curtain. A narrow bed, a reading chair, a small table with a lamp. Personal items were scattered about with the casual disorder of daily life. This wasn't storage or occasional use. Someone lived here. I examined the belongings carefully, looking for identification or clues about the occupant. The clothes were well maintained but showed wear. Books on the table covered topics ranging from carpentry to legal procedures. A notebook lay open, filled with handwriting I didn't recognize. The pages contained what appeared to be observations about the house, notes about repairs needed and tasks completed. One entry caught my attention. She's becoming suspicious about the arrangement, may need to accelerate the timeline. The date was recent, written within the past week. My hands trembled as I turned the pages, finding more references to plans and timelines, to people identified only by initials. My sister's initial appeared frequently, always in contexts that suggested ongoing communication. The sound of a car door slamming outside sent me moving quickly toward the basement window. Through the dirty glass, I could see a sedan parked in the driveway. My sister emerged from the driver's side, but she wasn't alone. A man accompanied her, the same height and build that would match the voice on the answering machine. I climbed the stairs as quietly as possible, reaching the main floor as I heard keys in the front door lock. There was nowhere to hide that wouldn't trap me, so I remained in the kitchen, trying to appear casual despite the racing of my heart. "I didn't expect you back so soon," my sister said as she entered, her voice carrying a note of surprise that seemed practiced rather than genuine. "I found some interesting things," I replied, watching her companion as he surveyed the room with the familiarity of someone who knew it well. He was older than my sister, with graying hair and hands that showed the calluses of manual work. When he looked at me, his expression was neither hostile nor welcoming, but calculating. He was measuring me, determining what I might represent to whatever plans were in motion. "This is the caretaker I mentioned," my sister said. "He's been helping maintain the property during the legal proceedings." But she hadn't mentioned him during our phone call. The lie came so smoothly that I wondered how many others had preceded it. I nodded politely, not trusting myself to speak without revealing what I had discovered. "The house needs work," he said, his voice matching the one from the answering machine. "Your aunt let some things go in her final months. I've been doing what I can to prevent further deterioration." His explanation was reasonable, but it didn't account for the living space in the basement or the personal nature of the phone message. I found myself studying my sister's face, looking for signs of deception or discomfort. She met my gaze steadily, but something in her expression had changed since our aunt's funeral, a hardness that hadn't been there before. We stood in the kitchen making small talk about repairs and property values, but underneath the mundane conversation, I sensed currents of tension and unspoken agreements. My sister and this man shared knowledge they weren't revealing, a history that predated my arrival at the house. "I should be going," I said finally, feeling the weight of their combined attention. "Thank you for showing me around." "Of course," my sister replied. "I'll keep you updated on the legal proceedings." But as I walked toward my car, I heard them begin talking in low voices behind the closed door. Their conversation was urgent, punctuated by pauses that suggested disagreement or concern. I sat in my car for several minutes, watching the house and trying to make sense of what I had discovered. The drive home passed in a blur of questions and possibilities. My sister had been secretive about the inheritance proceedings, always claiming that legal complications were delaying resolution. But what if the complications were of her own making? What if the mysterious caretaker represented something more than property maintenance? I thought about our aunt, a woman who had lived alone for decades after her husband's death. She had been private about her personal life, but generous with family, always ready to help during difficult times. The idea that she might have had a relationship the family didn't know about wasn't impossible, but it raised questions about her final wishes and the disposition of her estate. That night, I called the lawyer handling the probate proceedings. His secretary informed me that my sister had requested all communications go through her as the primary beneficiary. When I explained that I was also mentioned in the will, she put me on hold for several minutes before returning with a different tone. "I'm sorry, but there seems to be some confusion about the beneficiaries. According to our records, you're not listed in the current version of the will." The words hit me like cold water. I had been present when our aunt discussed her intentions, had been assured that both my sister and I would inherit portions of her estate. The lawyer's secretary agreed to send me a copy of the will on file, but warned that it might take several days to process the request. I spent the following days researching property records and legal filings, trying to understand what had happened to my aunt's estate. The public records showed that ownership of the house had been transferred to my sister shortly before our aunt's death, a transaction that didn't align with the family discussions I remembered. When the will arrived by mail, I read it with growing disbelief. The document was dated only months before our aunt's death and left everything to my sister, with no mention of other family members. But the signature looked different from other documents I had seen, shakier and less confident than our aunt's usual bold handwriting. I made copies of everything and drove back to the house, determined to confront my sister with what I had discovered. But when I arrived, the property appeared empty. No cars in the driveway, no lights in the windows. I used the spare key I had kept from childhood visits, letting myself in through the back door. The house felt different now, emptier but also more tense, as if it were holding secrets that pressed against the walls. I went directly to the basement, finding the living space I had discovered before, but now it was being dismantled, personal items packed into boxes and the furniture pushed against the walls. On the workbench, I found a stack of documents that made everything clear. Legal papers, financial records, and correspondence that detailed a plan to manipulate our aunt's final wishes. My sister had been working with the caretaker to isolate our aunt from the rest of the family, convincing her to change her will and transfer property while she was in declining health. But the most disturbing discovery was a series of photographs showing our aunt in her final months. She appeared confused and frail, being guided through document signings by people whose faces were just outside the frame. The images suggested coercion, a systematic effort to take advantage of an elderly woman's vulnerability. I heard footsteps upstairs and quickly gathered the most incriminating documents, stuffing them into my jacket before moving toward the basement stairs. The voices above were familiar, my sister and her accomplice returning to complete their cleanup. "Everything needs to be gone by tonight," my sister was saying. "The new buyers take possession next week." New buyers. She had sold the house without informing the family, another decision made in secret. I waited in the basement until I heard them move to the upper floor, then slipped out through the basement door that led to the backyard. But as I drove away, I realized that having evidence and being able to use it were different things. My sister had covered her tracks carefully, creating a legal framework that would be difficult to challenge. The caretaker had been smart about his involvement, staying in the background and avoiding official documentation. I spent weeks consulting with lawyers and investigators, but the responses were discouraging. The will had been properly witnessed and notarized. The property transfers had followed legal procedures. Without proof of coercion or fraud, the courts were unlikely to overturn decisions made by a competent adult. The house sold quickly, and my sister moved to another state, claiming she needed distance from the painful memories. She sent a brief note thanking me for understanding and promising to stay in touch, but her phone number was disconnected within a month. I drive past the property sometimes, seeing new owners who have painted the exterior and planted different flowers in the garden. They seem happy there, unaware of the deception that preceded their ownership. The house looks peaceful in the afternoon light, giving no hint of the secrets it once harbored. But I still have the documents I found that day, stored in a safety deposit box along with my own notes and observations. Sometimes I wonder if I should have pushed harder, fought longer, demanded more answers. Other times I question whether I understood what I was seeing, whether my suspicions were justified or simply the product of grief and family tensions. The truth remains elusive, wrapped in legal documents and careful planning that left few traces. My sister succeeded in her deception, but I carry the knowledge of what she did, a weight that grows heavier with time. The crime was perfect in its legality, devastating in its betrayal of trust and family bonds. I wonder sometimes if our aunt knew what was happening in her final months, if she understood how her kindness was being exploited. Or perhaps she was simply tired, ready to let others make decisions she no longer wanted to face. The uncertainty haunts me more than definitive knowledge might have. The case, if it can be called that, remains closed in all official senses. But in my mind, it continues to unfold, revealing new possibilities and raising fresh questions about the nature of family, trust, and the quiet crimes that hide behind legal facades. Story 5. The mirror didn't catch my image. I stepped closer, half expecting the familiar blur of my outline, but it stared back, empty and unyielding. Outside, the usual creak of the porch swing was absent, as if the wind had forgotten its touch. My feet crossed the threshold, feeling an unfamiliar smoothness underfoot, a floor that neither welcomed nor resisted. On the wall, the clock's hands lay still, though time itself felt stretched thin. I reached for the light switch, but the darkness held its ground, untouched by my intention. A shadow, not mine, lingered in the corner of my eye, refusing to dissolve into the dimness. I know what happened that night. The certainty sits in my chest like a stone, heavy and unmovable. She came home late, as she always did when the arguments got too heated. The front door slammed with that particular force she reserved for her worst moods, rattling the picture frames on the hallway wall. I heard her heels click across the hardwood, each step deliberate and sharp. The house had been empty for hours before her return. I'd been waiting in the living room, watching the headlights sweep across the ceiling as cars passed on the street outside. The television droned in the background, some late-night talk show I wasn't really following. When her key turned in the lock, I knew immediately it was her from the way she fumbled with the mechanism, the soft curse under her breath. She went straight to the kitchen. I heard the refrigerator open, the clink of glass against glass. The ice maker groaned and dispensed its contents into what I assumed was her usual tumbler. These sounds were as familiar to me as my own breathing. We'd lived this routine countless times before. That's when I decided to go upstairs. My legs felt heavy as I climbed, each step creaking under my weight. The banister was smooth under my palm, worn down by years of hands sliding along its surface. At the top of the stairs, I paused, listening to the sounds below. She was moving around the kitchen, opening cabinets, the soft thud of items being set on the counter. I walked down the hallway toward the bedroom, past the photographs that lined the walls. Family gatherings, vacations, ordinary moments captured and framed. In the dim light filtering up from downstairs, their faces looked different somehow, more distant than I remembered. The bedroom door was already open. I stepped inside, and that's when I noticed the mirror. It should have shown my reflection as I passed, but instead it held only the room behind me, empty and waiting. The bed was unmade, sheets twisted as if someone had struggled with sleep. On the nightstand, a glass of water sat half empty, a thin film of dust on its surface. I stood there for what felt like a long time, listening to the sounds from below. She was still moving around, but the noises had become softer, more deliberate. The house settled around us with its familiar creaks and sighs. But now, as I replay that night in my mind, something doesn't align properly. The memory feels like a photograph that's been slightly overexposed, the edges blurred and uncertain. I remember going upstairs, but I can't quite recall making the decision to do so. The movement feels automatic, as if I was following a script I'd memorized without realizing it. The mirror troubles me most. I've stood in front of that same mirror thousands of times, watching myself brush my teeth, comb my hair, adjust my clothes before leaving for work. It's an ordinary mirror, nothing special about it except for the small chip in the lower right corner where someone had dropped a perfume bottle years ago. But that night, it showed me nothing. I try to remember what I was wearing, what I looked like as I climbed those stairs. The details slip away like water through my fingers. I know I was there, I can feel the memory of being there, but the specifics remain frustratingly out of reach. The sounds from the kitchen had stopped by the time I noticed the clock. Its hands were frozen, pointing to an hour that felt both late and early simultaneously. I stared at it, waiting for the second hand to resume its steady sweep, but it remained motionless. The silence from downstairs had become complete, as if the house itself was holding its breath. When I think about it now, that silence seems wrong. She was never quiet, especially not when she was upset. She would bang cabinet doors, slam glasses down harder than necessary, mutter complaints under her breath. The absence of sound should have been my first warning that something was different. I remember walking back to the hallway, my feet making no sound on the carpet. The photographs on the walls seemed to watch me pass, their frozen smiles suddenly feeling less warm, more like masks. At the top of the stairs, I paused again, straining to hear any sign of movement below. The house felt different then, not just quiet but hollow, as if all the life had been drained out of it. The air tasted stale, recycled, like breathing inside a closed container. I gripped the banister and started down, each step careful and measured. The living room was exactly as I'd left it. The television still played its late-night programming, the volume low enough to be background noise. My chair sat empty, the cushion still bearing the impression of my body. On the side table, my own glass sat forgotten, ice long since melted into lukewarm water. But the kitchen was empty. I stood in the doorway, scanning the familiar space. The refrigerator hummed quietly in the corner. The counters were clean, everything in its proper place. There was no glass on the counter, no sign that anyone had been there at all. Even the ice maker was silent, as if it hadn't been used in hours. This is where my certainty begins to crack. I know I heard her come home. I know I heard her in the kitchen, moving around, getting that drink, but the evidence of my senses doesn't match the evidence of my eyes. The kitchen tells a story of emptiness, of a space undisturbed for hours. I opened the refrigerator looking for some sign of her presence. The bottles stood in neat rows, none missing, none moved. The ice bucket in the freezer was full, undisturbed. I ran my finger along the counter where I was certain I'd heard her set down her glass, but the surface was clean and dry. Standing there in that empty kitchen, I began to question what I'd actually heard. The sounds had been so familiar, so perfectly matching my expectations, that I'd never thought to doubt them. but familiarity can be deceptive. The mind has a way of filling in gaps, of providing what it expects to experience rather than what actually occurs. I walked through the house again, more carefully this time. Each room was exactly as it should be, exactly as I'd left it. But there was something in the air, a quality of disturbance that I couldn't quite identify. It was like the feeling you get when you know someone has been in your space, even when nothing appears to have been touched. The front door was locked, the chain still in place. I examined the lock, looking for signs that it had been recently used, but the metal showed no scratches, no indication of a key being inserted. The door frame was undisturbed, the weather stripping in place. Yet I was certain I'd heard that door slam. The sound was burned into my memory, sharp and final. I'd felt the vibration of it through the floor, seen the way the pictures on the wall had shifted slightly in their frames. But now, looking at those same pictures, they hung perfectly straight, undisturbed. I returned to the living room and sank into my chair. The television continued its late-night murmur, but I wasn't listening anymore. Instead, I was trying to reconstruct the evening, to separate what I knew from what I thought I knew. The waiting part was real. I remembered that clearly. I'd been sitting in this same chair for hours, watching the light fade outside, listening to the ordinary sounds of the neighborhood settling into night. Cars had passed, their headlights sweeping across the walls. A dog had barked somewhere in the distance. These details felt solid, reliable. But everything after that, everything I'd been so certain about, now seemed less definite. The sounds from the kitchen, the familiar routine of her late return, even my own decision to go upstairs, all of it felt suddenly questionable. I closed my eyes and tried to remember her face, the way she looked when she was angry, the particular set of her shoulders when she was trying to make a point, but the image wouldn't come into focus. It was like trying to remember a dream. The harder I concentrated, the more it slipped away. The house around me felt different now, charged with possibility rather than certainty. Every creak of the settling wood, every whisper of air through the vents could mean something other than what I'd always assumed. The familiar had become foreign, the known had become mysterious. I opened my eyes and looked around the room with new attention. The furniture was arranged exactly as it always had been, but now I noticed things I'd overlooked before. The way the lamp cast shadows that could hide or reveal. The way the mirror above the fireplace reflected not just the room, but angles and perspectives I'd never considered. That mirror was working perfectly, showing me my own face, tired and confused. But upstairs, the other mirror had shown me nothing. The difference between them seemed significant now, though I couldn't say why. I got up and walked to the window, looking out at the empty street. The porch swing hung motionless in the still air, its chains catching the light from the street lamp. I'd heard it creaking earlier, or thought I had, but now I couldn't be sure if the sound had come from outside or from somewhere else entirely. The night felt full of questions I hadn't thought to ask. Who had I been waiting for? Why had I been so certain of her return? And most troubling of all, why couldn't I remember her face? I went back upstairs, drawn by a need to understand what had happened in that bedroom. The hallway felt longer this time, the photographs more like strangers than family. At the bedroom door, I hesitated, suddenly afraid of what I might find. The mirror still showed only the empty room. I stood directly in front of it, waving my hand, moving from side to side, but my reflection never appeared. The glass was clean, uncracked, perfectly ordinary in every way except for its refusal to acknowledge my presence. I reached out and touched the surface. It was cold and smooth, exactly as a mirror should be. but when I pulled my hand away, there was no fingerprint on the glass, no evidence that I'd touched it at all. The bed looked different too. The sheets weren't just unmade, they were arranged in a way that suggested violence or struggle, or perhaps just restless sleep. I couldn't tell which, and the uncertainty made my chest tight with anxiety. On the nightstand, that glass of water sat exactly as before, but now I noticed other details. The dust on its surface wasn't random. It had settled in patterns that suggested the glass had been sitting there for days, maybe weeks. Yet the water inside was clear, fresh-looking. I picked up the glass and held it to the light. The water was indeed fresh, no taste of staleness or age. But the outside of the glass told a different story, one of abandonment and neglect. Nothing made sense anymore. The physical evidence contradicted itself at every turn. Fresh water in a dusty glass, an empty kitchen that I'd heard someone using, a mirror that refused to show my reflection. Each detail was perfectly ordinary on its own, but together they created a picture that didn't fit any reality I understood. I set the glass back down and noticed something else. The nightstand itself was dusty, except for a perfect circle where the glass had been sitting. But there was another circle too, fainter but still visible, a few inches away. As if someone had moved the glass recently, or as if there had been two glasses there at some point. The implications of this discovery made my head spin. If there had been two glasses, where was the other one? Who had been drinking from it? And why couldn't I remember? I searched the room more carefully, looking for other signs of a second presence. In the closet, clothes hung in neat rows, but some of them seemed unfamiliar. Had they always been there? I couldn't be sure. The dresser drawers held the usual collection of personal items, but their arrangement felt slightly off, as if someone had been through them recently. On the floor beside the bed, I found something that made me stop breathing. A single earring, small and silver, catching the light from the hallway. I picked it up and held it in my palm, trying to remember if I'd seen it before. It was pretty delicate, the kind of thing someone might wear to dinner or to a party. But whose was it? I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the earring, trying to make sense of what I was discovering. The house I thought I knew so well was revealing secrets I'd never suspected. Every familiar object now seemed to hold multiple possibilities, multiple stories. The clock on the wall remained frozen, its hands pointing to that same impossible hour. But now I wondered if it had been broken for longer than just tonight. Maybe it had been stopped for days, weeks, and I simply hadn't noticed. Maybe my sense of time, like everything else, was more fragile than I'd realized. I went back downstairs, the earring clutched in my hand like evidence of something I couldn't name. The kitchen still showed no signs of recent use, but I opened every cabinet, checked every surface, looking for clues I might have missed. In the dishwasher I found clean glasses, recently washed, but how recently? And by whom? The dishes told me nothing definitive, only that someone had been here, someone had used these things, someone had cleaned up afterward. The more I searched, the more questions I found. The house was full of evidence of life, of presence, of activity, but none of it pointed to any specific person or time. It was as if multiple realities were occupying the same space, overlapping and contradicting each other. I returned to the living room and sat in my chair, trying to think. The television was still playing, but the programs had changed. How long had I been searching? The light outside was different too, though I couldn't say if it was getting lighter or darker. The certainty I'd started with was completely gone now. I no longer knew what had happened that night, or even if anything had happened at all. The sounds I'd heard, the presence I'd sensed, the routine I'd thought I recognized, all of it could have been imagination, memory, or wishful thinking. But the earring in my palm was real. The mirror upstairs that wouldn't show my reflection was real. The stopped clock, the dusty glass with fresh water, the 2 circles on a nightstand, all of these things were real and present and unexplained. I closed my eyes and tried to remember who I'd been waiting for, but the harder I tried, the more the memory slipped away. I could remember the feeling of waiting, the anticipation, the certainty that someone would return, but I couldn't remember who. Was it possible I'd been waiting for no one, that the sounds I'd heard were echoes of other nights, other returns, other routines that had become so familiar I could hear them even when they weren't happening? Or was it possible that someone had been here, someone I couldn't quite remember, someone who had left traces of their presence but had somehow erased themselves from my conscious memory? The questions multiplied faster than I could answer them. Each possibility led to more possibilities. Each explanation required further explanations. The simple story I'd started with had become a maze of uncertainty and doubt. I opened my eyes and looked around the room again. Everything was exactly as it should be, exactly as it always was. But now I understood that exactly as it should be might mean something very different from what I'd always assumed. The house held its secrets quietly, neither confirming nor denying my suspicions. The mirror above the fireplace showed me my own face, confused and searching. But upstairs, that other mirror continued to show me nothing at all. I stood up, still holding the earring, and walked to the front door. The lock was secure, the chain in place, everything normal. But normal had become a word without meaning, a concept I could no longer trust. Outside, the porch swing moved slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. The street was empty, lined with houses full of people sleeping peacefully, untroubled by questions they didn't know they should be asking. I turned back to the house, my house, and realized I might never know what had really happened that night. The truth was buried somewhere beneath layers of assumption and expectation, beneath the comfortable certainty of routine and familiarity. But I knew I would keep looking, keep questioning, keep searching for answers that might not exist. Because the alternative, accepting that I couldn't trust my own perceptions, my own memories, my own understanding of reality, was too frightening to contemplate. The earring in my palm caught the light from the street lamp outside, a small silver mystery that proved someone had been here, even if I couldn't remember who. And that was something, at least, a starting point for questions I was only beginning to learn how to ask. Story 6. The latch hummed quietly but refused to click. My fingers traced its edge, anticipating the familiar resistance, yet it yielded seamlessly. As I walked through the hallway, the temperature dipped unnaturally, pockets of coolness where warmth should have lingered. The corridor absorbed my footfalls, the usual echo absent, as if the walls themselves withheld their acknowledgement. My tread, light as it was, should have prompted the gentle creak from the aging floorboards, yet they lay silent beneath my weight. The air felt thick, as if holding its breath, and I hesitated, reaching for a light switch that didn't seem to remember its function. The room ahead, the one that should have glowed with late afternoon light, remained shadowed, its boundaries uncertain, as if it wished to keep its secrets just a little longer. The wallpaper caught my attention first. Pale roses on cream background, the same pattern that had welcomed me every day for months. Yet today the blooms seemed faded, their pink petals bleached to the color of old bone. I remembered choosing this paper together, how we'd laughed at the salesman's insistence that florals were making a comeback. The roses had been vibrant then, almost aggressive in their cheerfulness. Now they appeared to shrink away from my gaze, as if embarrassed by their own presence on the wall. The coffee mug sat exactly where it shouldn't have been. On the kitchen counter beside the sink, its handle turned at precisely the angle that would make it easy for a left-handed person to grasp. But I was right-handed, had always been right-handed. The mug bore a small chip on its rim, a flaw I'd grown accustomed to avoiding when I drank. The coffee inside had formed a thin skin, suggesting it had been sitting for hours. I couldn't recall making coffee that morning. Couldn't recall much about the morning at all, really. The photograph on the mantelpiece drew my eyes like a magnet draws iron filings. Two figures stood before a lake, arms around each other's waists, faces bright with summer happiness. I recognized myself easily enough, but the other person seemed somehow unfamiliar, as if the camera had captured a stranger wearing a beloved face. The frame itself was silver, tarnished in spots I'd never noticed before. When had those dark patches appeared? How long had I been looking at this image without truly seeing it? The scent in the bedroom was wrong, not unpleasant exactly, but foreign. Where I expected the familiar blend of lavender fabric softener and the vanilla candle that lived on the nightstand, I found something else entirely. Something green and earthy, like wet leaves or fresh-turned soil. It clung to the curtains, seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. I opened the window, but the outside air carried the same strange perfume, as if the smell had followed me rather than preceded me. The bed was made with military precision, corners tucked and smoothed until not a wrinkle remained. This should have pleased me. I'd always been particular about such things, but something felt off about the arrangement. The pillows were positioned incorrectly, both on the left side of the bed when one should have been on the right. The comforter, a deep blue that had always reminded me of midnight sky, now seemed almost black in the strange light filtering through the windows. The book on the nightstand lay open to a page I didn't remember reading. The spine was cracked from frequent handling, though I could have sworn it had been pristine when I'd brought it home from the bookstore. The story itself seemed familiar yet foreign, like overhearing a conversation in a language you'd once known but had forgotten. My finger traced the lines of text, but the words seemed to shift and blur, refusing to hold their meaning long enough for comprehension. The mirror in the hallway reflected everything except what it should have. The walls appeared correctly, the ceiling light fixture hung in its proper place, even the small table beneath the glass showed up exactly as expected. But the space where I stood remained curiously empty, as if I were no more substantial than a thought, no more present than a memory. I moved closer, then stepped back, but the reflection remained stubbornly incomplete. The telephone sat silent on its cradle, yet I could swear it had been ringing when I'd entered the house. The sound had drawn me forward, had pulled me through rooms that seemed both familiar and strange. Now it crouched like a sleeping animal, its black surface reflecting nothing. The answering machine beside it blinked steadily, indicating messages, but when I pressed the play button, only static emerged, punctuated by long stretches of what might have been breathing. The kitchen window overlooked the garden, but the view seemed compressed, as if someone had pushed the background closer to the house. The oak tree that had always stood at a comfortable distance now appeared to loom directly outside the glass. Its branches, bare despite the season, scratched against the window with a sound like fingernails on wood. I didn't remember the tree being so close, didn't remember its limbs reaching quite so far. The refrigerator hummed with mechanical contentment, but its interior told a different story. Food I didn't remember buying sat on shelves I didn't remember arranging. A carton of milk bore a date that seemed both impossibly recent and disturbingly old. Leftovers in containers I'd never seen before emanated smells that made my stomach turn. The ice maker chattered and dispensed cubes into a bin that was somehow always full, no matter how many times I checked. The closet door stood slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness that seemed deeper than it should have been. Clothes hung in neat rows, organized by color and season, exactly as they'd always been. but among the familiar garments lurked items. I couldn't place a coat in a shade of green I'd never worn, shoes in a style I'd never favored. They hung there as if they'd always belonged, as if I were the intruder in my own wardrobe. The basement stairs creaked with each step, a sound I'd grown to find comforting over the months. But today the creaks seemed to form a pattern, almost like a code. The rhythm was wrong, the pitch slightly off, as if the wood itself were trying to communicate something I couldn't quite understand. At the bottom, the familiar mustiness had been replaced by something else, something that reminded me of hospitals and disinfectant. The boxes in the basement sat exactly where I'd left them, labeled in handwriting I recognized as my own. But when I opened one, the contents made no sense. Personal items that should have held meaning appeared foreign and strange. A watch I couldn't remember wearing, jewelry in styles I'd never favored, books inscribed with messages in a hand that looked like mine but felt like a forgery. The furnace kicked on with its usual mechanical sigh, but the air it pushed through the vents carried whispers of conversation I couldn't quite make out. Words that might have been my name, phrases that sounded like questions, responses to statements I couldn't remember making. The heating ducts amplified and distorted these sounds until they became a constant murmur, like voices in another room discussing matters of grave importance. The living room furniture had been rearranged in subtle ways that made the space feel foreign. The sofa faced a different direction, angled toward a corner that held nothing of interest. The coffee table had been moved 6 inches to the left, creating an awkward gap that made walking through the room feel like navigating an obstacle course. These small changes accumulated into a sense of displacement that made my skin crawl. The television screen held a reflection that moved independently of my movements. While I stood still, the figure in the glass shifted and gestured, as if trying to communicate across an impossible distance. When I moved, it remained motionless, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. The remote control lay on the table where I'd left it, but pressing the power button produced only snow and static. The curtains throughout the house had been drawn closed, though I couldn't remember closing them. They hung heavy and still, blocking out light that should have been streaming through the windows. When I pulled them aside, the view beyond seemed wrong. Familiar landmarks appeared in incorrect positions. Distances seemed compressed or extended without logic. The street outside looked like a photograph that had been poorly retouched. The mail on the hall table consisted entirely of letters addressed to someone whose name I almost recognized but couldn't quite place. The handwriting on the envelope seemed familiar, like something I might have written during a fevered dream. Inside, the messages spoke of shared experiences I couldn't recall, referenced conversations I couldn't remember having. They were signed with initials that might have been mine, written in a hand that was almost, but not quite, my own. The kitchen clock had stopped at an hour that felt significant but meaningless. Its hands pointed to positions that created angles my eyes found uncomfortable to follow. The second hand twitched occasionally, as if trying to resume its journey around the face, but always returned to the same position. Time itself seemed to have paused in this room, waiting for something to happen or someone to arrive. The diary I found in the bedroom drawer was written in my handwriting, but described a life I didn't recognize. The entry spoke of daily routines that weren't mine, relationships I couldn't recall, emotions I didn't remember feeling. Yet the voice was unmistakably my own, the observations and concerns exactly the kind I might have recorded. Reading it felt like discovering I'd been living a double life I knew nothing about. The house key in my pocket was the right size and shape, fit the locks perfectly, but felt wrong in my hand. The metal was too warm, as if it had been recently held by someone else. The teeth were worn in patterns that suggested years of use, though I couldn't recall owning it for more than a few months. It opened every door it should have, but each lock turned with a reluctance that made me question whether I truly belonged here. The final detail that stopped me cold was the simplest one of all. My own shadow, cast by the late afternoon light filtering through the kitchen window, fell in the wrong direction entirely. While the light came from the west, my shadow stretched toward it rather than away, as if the laws of physics had decided to make an exception just for me. I moved, and the shadow moved with me, but always in that impossible direction, always reaching toward the light instead of fleeing from it. Story 7. I mentioned I had only seen the outside. The leaves were rustling gently, and the sun dipped low, casting long shadows. They jotted it down, moved along. Yet my shoes bore a fine layer of ash, soft like whispers underfoot. The scent of fresh paint clung to my jacket, stubborn and acrid. The windows bore smudges of hurried fingers, and a single beam of light cut sharply through the dust in the corridor. I omitted the note slipped into my pocket, the paper's edge still pressing against my thigh. But the trace of lavender lingered in my hair. The ash tells its own story, gray powder, fine as flour, collected in the treads of my walking shoes. I remember brushing it off later that evening, watching the particles scatter across my bathroom tiles like scattered thoughts. Ash doesn't simply appear, something burns first, wood, paper, fabric. The consistency was wrong for fireplace residue, too uniform, too clean, industrial perhaps, or deliberate. The way it clung suggested moisture in the air, a dampness that contradicts the version I gave them about standing outside in the fading sunlight. Fresh paint carries weight beyond its chemical signature. The smell invaded my nostrils with that particular sharpness of latex base, the kind used for interior walls, not the oil-based exterior paint you'd expect from renovation work visible from the street. This scent embedded itself deep in the fibers of my wool jacket, the kind of penetration that requires extended exposure in an enclosed space. I tried washing the jacket twice before the odor finally faded. The dry cleaner asked what I'd been painting. I told her nothing. Those window smudges haunt me more than they should. Fingerprints pressed against glass from the inside, desperate and hurried. The pattern suggested someone trying to see out rather than in. Palm prints, too, flat against the surface as if steadying against dizziness or fear. The afternoon light revealed every mark, every desperate touch. When I dream now, I see those windows, and sometimes the hands are still there, still pressing, still trying to escape something I claimed never to have witnessed. The corridor existed in contradiction to my statement. Dust motes danced in that single shaft of light, disturbed and swirling, evidence of recent passage. The beam cut through from a window I should not have seen if I had remained outside as claimed. The dust itself told stories of footsteps, of movement through spaces that should have been empty. The light illuminated everything and nothing, revealing the lie by its very presence in my memory. Paper holds secrets in its texture. The note in my pocket was thick stock, expensive, with a slight texture that suggested quality stationery. The fold was precise, deliberate, not the hasty crease of something written in panic. The edge pressed against my leg through the fabric, a constant reminder of words unread in that moment. I knew opening it then would have changed everything, would have made me complicit in ways I wasn't prepared for. The paper warmed against my body heat, as if the message itself was alive, waiting. Lavender doesn't occur naturally in my daily routine. I use unscented soap, neutral shampoo, nothing floral or feminine. The scent in my hair was foreign, imported from proximity to someone who wore it like a signature, sweet but complex with undertones of something earthier. The fragrance lingered for hours, a ghostly presence that followed me home. I found myself touching my hair throughout the evening, trying to place the exact moment the scent transferred. The memory of that touch remains more vivid than any words we might have exchanged. The inconsistencies multiply under examination. My statement described autumn leaves rustling, yet the ash on my shoes suggests something burning, something ending in a different way than seasonal change. The paint fumes indicate interior work, fresh application, perhaps covering something that needed hiding. The window prints speak of someone inside, someone who needed to see out to escape or signal. The corridor dust proves movement through spaces, presence where I claimed absence. Temperature variations tell their own truth. The warmth I remember contradicts the cool autumn air I described. Inside air, heated air, the kind that carries paint fumes and lavender and the subtle staleness of spaces recently occupied. My jacket retained that warmth long after I should have been standing in evening coolness. The contrast between what I felt and what I reported grows sharper with each recollection. Sound memory proves more reliable than visual. The rustling leaves were real, but underneath, if I concentrate, other sounds emerge. Footsteps on hardwood floors, the creak of old hinges, the soft whisper of paper being folded. These audio layers existed simultaneously with the natural sounds I emphasized. The mind filters what it can accept, suppresses what threatens the story we need to tell ourselves and others. The note's weight shifts in my pocket even now, though I disposed of it days ago. Phantom pressure, the ghost of evidence I couldn't bear to preserve or fully destroy. The words, when I finally read them in the safety of my own home, changed nothing and everything. They confirmed what the ash and paint and fingerprints had already whispered. They named what I pretended not to witness. Light plays tricks with truth. That corridor beam illuminated dust, yes, but also revealed the careful cleaning that had happened around it. Someone had swept, wiped, erased most traces, but missed the places where afternoon sun would reveal the remaining evidence. The cleaning was thorough but imperfect, done by someone unfamiliar with how light moves through that particular space at that specific time of day. My shoes remember what I choose to forget. The ash wasn't the only foreign substance in those treads. Tiny fragments of glass, so small they required a magnifying glass to identify, embedded themselves alongside the gray powder. Safety glass, the kind that crumbles rather than shatters, designed to minimize injury during impact. The pieces were fresh, sharp-edged despite their size, suggesting recent breakage. The lavender scent carries darker undertones in memory. What seemed like perfume or shampoo reveals itself as something more complex under analysis. Lavender oil, perhaps, used medicinally, the kind applied to temples for anxiety, to wrists for calm. The concentration was too strong for casual use, more like someone who needed its properties desperately, someone fighting panic or pain. Shadows on the wall tell time more accurately than my testimony. The angle of that afternoon light, the specific way it cut through the corridor, places me inside the building far later than the casual outside observation I described. The shadows were long, yes, but not the shadows of someone standing in a yard looking at a building's exterior. These were interior shadows, cast by window frames and doorways, by architectural details visible only from within. Paint patterns matter more than paint presence. The fumes weren't just fresh application, but careful coverage, the kind of rushed job that prioritizes concealment over aesthetics. Multiple coats applied quickly, without proper drying time between layers. The smell was wrong for professional work, too intense, too hurried. Someone painted over something that needed hiding, and they did it fast. The note's paper grain runs vertically, expensive stock torn from a bound journal rather than cut from loose sheets. The tear was clean but urgent, done with fingernails rather than tools. The person who wrote it had access to quality materials but not the time or composure to use them properly. The message itself, those words I can never unread, was written in blue ink that bled slightly into the paper fibers, suggesting a fountain pen held by an unsteady hand. My reflection in those smudged windows showed someone who belonged inside, not someone observing from outside. The angle was wrong for exterior viewing, the distance incorrect for the story I constructed. In that glass I appeared as an interior figure, someone present for events I claimed to know nothing about. The reflection doesn't lie the way memory can be convinced to lie. Dust accumulation follows patterns of human movement. The corridor showed clear paths where feet had traveled, spaces where the dust remained undisturbed, and areas where something had been dragged or moved recently. The single beam of light revealed a map of activity, a timeline written in disturbed particles and clean spaces. Someone had tried to erase evidence, but succeeded only in creating different evidence. The warmth in my jacket came from more than heated air. Body heat transferred during proximity I haven't acknowledged. The kind of warmth that comes from standing close to someone, from contact, however brief. The fabric held that heat like a secret, radiating it back against my skin long after the source was gone. Human warmth, desperate and fading. Glass fragments tell stories of impact and intention. The pieces in my shoe treads came from something broken from the inside out, safety glass designed for windows or doors that someone needed to escape through or had struck in desperation. The fragments were too small and too embedded to have come from casual exterior observation. I had walked through the aftermath, stepped in the evidence of someone's desperate moment. The lavender now seems medicinal in a different way, not calming but masking. Strong enough to cover other scents, applied liberally to hair and skin to hide what shouldn't be detected. The sweetness was deliberate camouflage, too concentrated to be mere preference. Someone needed to smell like flowers instead of whatever they actually smelled like. Someone needed to disappear into innocence. My statement focused on autumn and endings, but the evidence points to beginnings. Fresh paint suggests preparation, not conclusion. The note in my pocket was an invitation, not a goodbye. The fingerprints on the windows were searching for something, not fleeing from it. I constructed a story of seasonal change and natural conclusion when the truth was about transformation and terrible new starts. The corridor dust swirls differently in memory now, disturbed not just by footsteps but by something being moved, something heavy dragged across the floor before the hasty cleaning began. The light beam caught particles that shouldn't have been airborne unless something significant had recently disturbed the settled dust of abandonment. The space wasn't empty when I claimed to observe it from outside. It was busy with purpose I pretended not to understand. That single shaft of light becomes more accusatory with each recollection, illuminating not just dust but my presence in a space I swore never to have entered. The angle, the intensity, the specific quality of late afternoon sun filtered through interior windows proves location and complicity beyond any reasonable doubt. The light doesn't lie, even when everything else in my statement does. The note remains unburned in my memory, though I fed it to flames days ago. The words rearrange themselves in dreams, forming new accusations, new truths I'm not prepared to acknowledge. Paper burns, but guilt preserves every letter, every plea, every instruction I followed despite claiming ignorance. The message lives now in the space between what I know and what I can admit to knowing. Story 8. The dim outline of the doorway hadn't budged since I first stood glued to the spot, a silent sentinel in my own home. The slant of light from the hallway painted slim shadows on the carpet, their edges too sharp, too pronounced, as if claiming a presence they did not own. Each minute stretched into echoes that played tricks, hinting at movements unseen. A draft, a whisper, both, and neither, each indistinct, each unsettling. My breath, shallow and deliberate, seemed the only sound until a gentle weight creased the corner rug, a shift so slight. It felt like a thought before I noticed it was real. I knew someone had been here. The certainty settled in my chest like cold water, though I couldn't pinpoint what had changed. The living room appeared untouched, the same magazines fanned across the coffee table, the same throw pillow positioned at the precise angle where she always left it. Yet something felt displaced, rearranged by invisible hands that had moved through my space with careful intention. The scent lingered first, not perfume, but something deeper, the metallic tang of keys held too long in sweaty palms, mixed with the faint chemical residue of cleaning products. It didn't belong to this room, to this house, to anyone I knew. I followed it like a thread, moving from the doorway toward the kitchen, my bare feet registering the subtle temperature changes in the hardwood floors. She had called that morning, her voice carrying that peculiar tremor it developed when she was lying. The conversation replayed in my mind as I examined the kitchen counters, searching for evidence of intrusion. She'd mentioned stopping by to collect her remaining books, the ones she'd left behind when she moved out. I'd been at work. I'd given her the spare key months ago, back when trust felt as natural as breathing. The books were gone, that much was obvious, but the empty shelf revealed something else, dust patterns that suggested more than literature had been removed. Rectangular shadows marked spots where other objects had rested, things I couldn't immediately identify. My memory felt unreliable, struggling to reconstruct what belonged in those vacant spaces. I opened the refrigerator, drawn by an impulse I didn't understand. Inside, the milk carton sat turned backward, its expiration date facing the rear wall. Such a small thing, yet it struck me as deliberate. She knew my habits, knew I always positioned labels forward. The gesture felt like a message, though its meaning remained opaque. The answering machine blinked with 2 messages. I pressed play, expecting her voice, but heard only silence punctuated by the sound of breathing, measured, patient breathing that continued for nearly a full minute before the line went dead. The second message offered the same, breath without words, as if someone had called simply to confirm my absence. I climbed the stairs to the bedroom we'd once shared, my hand trailing along the banister she'd polished every weekend with obsessive precision. The wood felt different beneath my palm, slightly sticky, as though someone with nervous hands had gripped it recently. The sensation followed me down the hallway, a tactile reminder that my solitude was an illusion. The bedroom door stood ajar, though I distinctly remembered closing it that morning. Inside, the bed remained unmade, sheets tangled in the same configuration I'd left them. But the dresser drawers had been opened and closed not quite properly, leaving hairline gaps that caught the afternoon light. Someone had searched through my belongings with methodical care, examining and replacing each item with near-perfect accuracy. Near perfect, but not flawless. The photograph on the nightstand had been moved a fraction to the left, creating a clean rectangle in the dust where it usually sat. The image showed both of us from happier times, our faces pressed together in manufactured joy. But now her expression seemed different, her smile carrying undertones I'd never noticed before. Or perhaps my perception had shifted, colored by recent revelations about the person I'd thought I knew. I found her journal wedged between the mattress and box spring, exactly where she used to hide it. My fingers hesitated before pulling it free. Reading it felt like a violation, yet leaving it unexamined seemed equally wrong. The leather cover was warm, as if recently handled, and fell open to a page marked with a torn envelope. Her handwriting filled the margins, documenting observations about my routines with clinical precision. The times I left for work, the routes I took, the people I spoke with. She'd been watching me, cataloging my habits like a researcher studying an unwitting subject. The entries grew more detailed over recent weeks, noting changes in my behavior that I hadn't recognized myself. The envelope contained photographs I'd never seen, images of me taken from a distance, captured during moments when I'd believed myself alone, walking to my car, checking the mail, standing at this very bedroom window. The pictures suggested surveillance spanning months, a patient documentation of my private life by someone I trusted completely. My phone buzzed with a text message. Her name appeared on the screen, but the words felt foreign, written in a voice I didn't recognize. "Did you find what I left for you?" I typed a response, deleted it, typed another. The cursor blinked accusingly as I struggled to formulate questions that might yield honest answers. Finally, I wrote, "Why?" Her reply came immediately, "You never really saw me." The statement hung in the digital space between us, loaded with implications I wasn't ready to process. I set the phone aside and returned to the journal, flipping through pages that chronicled our relationship from her perspective. The entries revealed a growing resentment, a sense that I'd been performing the role of loving partner while remaining fundamentally disconnected from her inner life. She wasn't wrong. I'd been content with surface interactions, satisfied by the illusion of intimacy without pursuing its deeper realities. But her response felt disproportionate, her methods invasive in ways that suggested something beyond mere romantic disappointment. The basement door creaked as I descended into the cool darkness below. I rarely ventured down here, leaving that territory to her when she'd lived here. She claimed to use it for storage, for organizing seasonal decorations and forgotten belongings. But now I wondered what else she might have kept in this subterranean space. The air smelled different, not musty like a typical basement, but sharp with the scent of developing chemicals. I found the makeshift darkroom she'd constructed in the corner, complete with enlarger and processing trays. Red light bulbs cast everything in hellish tones, transforming familiar objects into sinister shapes. Photographs hung from a clothesline stretched between support beams. Not the candid shots from the envelope, but something more intimate, images of me sleeping, unaware of the camera's presence. My face looked peaceful in these pictures, vulnerable in ways that felt like a betrayal of trust. She'd been documenting me even in unconsciousness, stealing moments I'd never consented to share. But it was the final photograph that stopped my breath entirely. The image showed me standing in this very basement, examining these very pictures. It had been taken from behind, capturing me in the act of discovery. The timestamp indicated it was shot just minutes ago. I spun around, scanning the shadows for signs of her presence. The basement felt suddenly smaller, its walls pressing inward as I realized she might still be here, watching from some hidden vantage point. My heart hammered against my ribs as I climbed the stairs, no longer certain whether I was alone in my own home. The front door stood open, though I was certain I'd locked it. Cool air flowed through the gap, carrying the sound of footsteps on gravel-measured steps that grew fainter with each passing second. I reached the threshold just in time to see a figure disappearing around the corner, too distant to identify but moving with familiar grace. Back inside, I discovered she'd left one final gift on the kitchen counter. A single key, not the spare I'd given her, but something older, more ornate. It looked like the key to a safety deposit box, though I'd never opened such an account. A note accompanied it, written in her careful script. Some secrets require proper storage. I turned the key over in my palm, feeling its weight, wondering what other revelations awaited discovery. The metal was warm, recently handled, and bore scratches that suggested frequent use. She'd been planning this moment, orchestrating my confusion with the same methodical patience she'd applied to everything else. The house felt different now, contaminated by the knowledge of her surveillance. Every corner might conceal a camera, every surface might bear the invisible residue of her touch. I'd been living in a fishbowl, my privacy dissolved by someone who claimed to love me while systematically violating my trust. Yet doubt crept in as I considered the evidence. The photographs could have been taken by anyone. The journal entries might be fabrications designed to manipulate my emotions. Even my memories of our relationship felt unreliable now, tainted by the possibility that nothing had been as it seemed. I called her number, but it went straight to voicemail. Her recorded voice sounded different than I remembered, warmer, more genuine than the person who'd been texting me. The disconnect made me question which version represented her true self, or whether I'd ever known her at all. The key remained in my hand, its edges sharp against my palm. Whatever secrets it unlocked would either confirm my suspicions or reveal new layers to this puzzle. But I wasn't certain I wanted those answers, wasn't sure I could handle additional revelations about the stranger who'd shared my bed and my life. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the walls in the same amber light that had first alerted me to the presence of an intruder. But now I wondered if the real intrusion had been happening all along, so gradually that I'd never noticed my privacy being stripped away piece by piece. The doorway where I'd first stood sentinel remained unchanged, its shadows still too sharp, still claiming a presence they didn't own. But now I understood that the presence wasn't supernatural or imagined, it was the ghost of trust. The lingering echo of a relationship built on foundations I'd never thought to examine. I pocketed the key and walked toward that threshold, no longer certain whether I was the observer or the observed, the investigator or the subject of investigation. The distinction seemed less important now, lost in the maze of mirrors she'd constructed around our shared life. The gentle weight that had creased the corner rug was gone, leaving only the memory of its impression. But I knew it would return, along with the whispers and drafts and all the other signs of a presence that existed in the spaces between certainty and doubt, between what I thought I knew and what I was only beginning to understand. Story 9. The front door neither groaned nor sighed. My fingertips traced the wooden grain, seeking the familiar coldness of neglect, yet it met me with indifferent stillness. I moved through the dim hallway, the usual echoes swallowed as if by walls suddenly dense and heavy. The air seemed to cling to my skin, pressing softly like an unanswered question. Shadows pretended not to shift as I passed, maintaining their position in a dance I couldn't follow. At the window, the latch didn't click as I nudged it, remaining steadfast in silence. I paused, my hand hovering, as if the glass might whisper back the secret it held. Something had already changed, though I couldn't pinpoint when. The house knew things I didn't, harbored conversations that happened in my absence. I found myself listening to the walls, pressing my ear against the plaster as if it might yield confessions. The silence had grown heavier, more purposeful, like a held breath that refused to release. The suspicion started somewhere in the spaces between words, not in what was said, but in the careful way certain subjects were avoided. I remember standing in the kitchen, watching steam rise from my coffee cup, when the realization crept in like cold air through an unsealed window. The conversation had stopped mid-sentence, not paused, stopped, as if someone had pressed an invisible button that muted the world around me. I began to notice the photographs first, not that they had been moved, but that they seemed to be watching from different angles. The one on the mantelpiece, a summer scene with faces turned toward the camera, appeared to shift its gaze when I wasn't looking directly at it. The eyes followed a trajectory I couldn't trace, focusing on something just beyond my peripheral vision. The mail arrived with suspicious regularity. Every piece addressed correctly, every envelope sealed with mechanical precision. But the letters inside felt hollow, as if the words had been carefully selected from a limited vocabulary. phrases repeated across different correspondents, identical sentence structures that suggested a single author wearing multiple masks. I started keeping them in a shoebox, arranging them by postmark, searching for patterns that danced just outside my comprehension. My reflection in the bathroom mirror began to lag, not noticeably just a fraction of a second behind my movements. I would raise my hand, and my mirror self would follow a heartbeat later, as if receiving delayed instructions. I tested this obsessively, making sudden gestures, watching for that infinitesimal gap between action and reflection. The mirror knew something I didn't, harbored a truth that existed in that sliver of time between cause and effect. The telephone calls came at predictable intervals, always when I was furthest from the receiver. By the time I reached it, the ringing would stop, leaving only the echo of sound in my ears. I began to time these interruptions, noting the precise moments when the silence would break. The pattern emerged slowly. Every call coincided with my deepest moments of concentration, as if something was monitoring my mental state, disrupting my thoughts before they could fully form. I found myself retracing conversations that might never have happened. Words spoken in dreams began to feel more real than waking dialogue. The boundary between memory and imagination blurred like watercolors in rain. I would catch myself responding to questions that hadn't been asked, finishing sentences that no one had started. The house breathed differently at night. During daylight hours, it maintained a facade of normalcy, creaks and settles that followed logical patterns of temperature and humidity. But after dark, the sounds became more deliberate, footsteps that matched no rhythm I recognized, doors closing in rooms I hadn't entered. The house was having conversations with itself, conducting business that didn't require my participation. I started leaving small objects in specific positions, a pen aligned with the edge of a table, a book open to a particular page, coins arranged in careful patterns. Each morning brought subtle alterations, not obvious enough to constitute evidence, but consistent enough to suggest intention. Someone or something was responding to my tests, engaging in a silent dialogue conducted through the movement of inanimate objects. The grocery store clerk began to anticipate my purchases. Before I could speak, items would appear on the counter exactly what I needed, in precisely the right quantities. When I questioned this prescience, the response came in the form of a knowing smile, as if we shared a secret I had forgotten. The receipt always showed the correct total, but the itemized list included things I didn't remember selecting. Sleep became a negotiation rather than a surrender. I would lie in bed, feeling consciousness slip away, only to snap back to alertness at the moment of transition. Something waited in that liminal space between waking and sleep, patient and persistent. My dreams, when they finally came, felt supervised, as if someone was editing them in real time, removing scenes that revealed too much, inserting others that obscured the truth. The neighbors' routines synchronized with mine in ways that defied coincidence. When I left the house, curtains would twitch in adjacent windows. When I returned, lights would dim in houses across the street. The entire block seemed to operate on a schedule that revolved around my movements, a choreography I hadn't consciously joined but couldn't escape. I began to document everything, filling notebooks with observations that seemed significant in the moment but read like fiction in retrospect. The handwriting appeared to change from page to page, as if multiple people were contributing to the record. Sometimes I would find entries I didn't remember making, written in my own hand but expressing thoughts I couldn't claim as my own. The weather responded to my moods with unsettling accuracy. Storms would gather when my anxiety peaked, clearing skies would emerge with moments of clarity. I started to feel responsible for meteorological events, as if my emotional state was being broadcast to atmospheric systems that adjusted accordingly. The barometric pressure seemed to press against my skull, whispering forecasts I couldn't quite understand. Time stretched and compressed without warning. Minutes would extend into subjective hours during moments of intense focus, while entire afternoons would collapse into fleeting impressions. I lost the ability to estimate duration, to predict how long simple tasks would require. The clock faces around the house showed times that felt arbitrary, numbers that bore no relationship to my internal sense of temporal flow. The photographs on the mantelpiece began to fade, but not uniformly. Certain faces grew dimmer while others remained sharp, as if the image was selectively forgetting specific individuals. I would study these changes obsessively, trying to determine which details were disappearing and why. The summer scene slowly transformed into something else entirely the same composition, but with different meaning, different implications. My coffee grew cold while I watched it, the steam dissipating in patterns that seemed too organized to be random. The liquid surface reflected images that didn't correspond to the ceiling above glimpses of rooms I didn't recognize, faces that looked familiar but couldn't be placed. I started drinking from opaque cups, avoiding reflections that told stories I wasn't ready to hear. The mail stopped arriving with such regularity. Envelopes appeared sporadically, often bearing postmarks from places I had never been. The return addresses led to streets that didn't exist, postal codes that belonged to no known system. I continued to collect these messages in the shoebox, but the patterns I had previously detected dissolved into chaos. The single author theory crumbled, replaced by the possibility of multiple correspondence, or perhaps no correspondence at all. My reflection in the bathroom mirror began to move independently. Not dramatically, just slight adjustments of posture, subtle changes in expression that didn't match my own. I would smile and my reflection would maintain a neutral expression. I would frown and it would offer a slight nod of acknowledgement. We were becoming separate entities, sharing the same space but following different scripts. The telephone calls intensified in frequency but diminished in duration. Single rings that cut off before I could react. The sound would linger in my ears long after the silence returned, creating phantom conversations that felt more substantial than actual dialogue. I began to anticipate these interruptions, positioning myself near the receiver, but the calls seemed to sense my readiness and would shift their timing accordingly. The house's nighttime conversations grew more animated. Entire discussions seemed to unfold in rooms I couldn't access, voices that rose and fell in patterns that suggested debate, negotiation, conflict resolution. I would press my ear against walls, trying to discern individual words, but the sounds remained tantalizingly out of reach, familiar cadences speaking an unknown language. The objects I arranged as tests began to multiply. What started as single items evolved into complex configurations that appeared overnight. My simple patterns were elaborated into intricate designs that suggested intelligence, creativity, perhaps even humor. Someone was not just responding to my tests, but improving upon them, engaging in a collaborative art project I hadn't consciously agreed to join. The grocery store clerk's anticipatory abilities expanded beyond purchases to include unspoken questions. Answers would be provided before I could formulate the queries, solutions offered to problems I hadn't yet recognized. The receipts grew longer, itemizing services and consultations that weren't part of normal retail transactions. I began to owe debts I couldn't calculate, obligations that extended beyond monetary exchange. Sleep became a performance rather than a private experience. I could feel observation during my most vulnerable moments, attention that cataloged my dreams, analyzed my unconscious movements. The sheets would be rearranged in my absence, folded into configurations that suggested someone had been studying my sleeping patterns, taking notes on my nocturnal behavior. The neighbors' synchronization evolved into active participation. They began to mirror my activities with increasing precision, gardening when I gardened, washing cars when I cleaned my windows, retrieving mail at exactly the moment I checked my own box. The entire block had become a chorus, with me as an unwitting conductor directing a symphony I couldn't hear. My notebooks filled with observations that contradicted each other. The same event would be recorded multiple times, each entry describing different details, different outcomes, different emotional responses. I began to suspect that someone was adding to these records, inserting alternative versions of experiences, creating a palimpsest of possibility where truth became negotiable. The weather's responsiveness to my moods became so acute that I started to feel like a meteorological instrument. My emotional states were being translated into atmospheric conditions with scientific precision. I began to monitor my feelings carefully, aware that my internal weather was being broadcast to systems beyond my control, affecting patterns that touched lives I would never know. The fading photographs revealed new images beneath the disappearing ones. As faces dimmed and backgrounds dissolved, different scenes emerged, the same location but different season, the same people but different ages, the same moment but different meaning. The mantelpiece had become a palimpsest of memory, layers of time exposed through selective erasure. I found myself returning to the window, the one with the latch that refused to click. My hand would hover over the mechanism, sensing the potential for sound that never materialized. The glass had become a barrier between two versions of reality, the one I inhabited and the one that existed just beyond reach. Sometimes I could see movement on the other side, shadows that didn't correspond to anything in my world. The suspicion that had crept in like cold air through an unsealed window now filled every room. It had become the atmosphere I breathed, the medium through which all perception was filtered. I could no longer distinguish between genuine observation and paranoid interpretation. Every detail carried equal weight, every coincidence suggested conspiracy, every silence implied secrets. The house continued to know things I didn't, to harbor conversations that happened in my absence. But now I realized I might be one of the voices in those conversations, speaking words I couldn't remember, participating in dialogues that occurred while I believed myself to be sleeping. The boundary between observer and observed had dissolved completely. Standing again at the window, my hand hovering over that silent latch, I understood that the secret the glass might whisper was not something hidden from me, but something I had forgotten I already knew. The shadows maintained their position in a dance I couldn't follow because I was already part of the choreography, moving to music I couldn't hear, following steps I had learned in dreams. The front door would neither groan nor sigh when I finally decided to leave, but I wondered now if that silence was a greeting rather than an absence recognition between conspirators who had been working together all along. My fingertips traced the wooden grain one more time, and in that familiar gesture, I felt the coldness of neglect transform into something else entirely, the warmth of a secret finally ready to reveal itself. Story 10. The entryway was undisturbed at the time of examination. Curtains hung without a crease, surfaces bore no dust or signs of recent activity. A single chair faced an empty space where a table might have stood, its legs perfectly aligned with the floor tiles. The ventilation system hummed at a consistent frequency, suggesting no recent manual intervention. Notably, all windows were placed in their standard locked positions. The outer perimeter showed no disturbances in the soil. Yet the indoor temperature registered 10 degrees below the norm. I wrote those words in my report, but they felt hollow as they left my pen. The clinical language couldn't capture what I sensed when I first stepped into that house. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. My partner had already moved deeper into the residence, but I remained in that entryway, studying the chair that faced nothing. The call had come in during the afternoon shift, a wellness check, they said. Neighbors hadn't seen the occupant for several cycles. The front door was unlocked when we arrived, which should have been our first real clue that something fundamental had shifted in this place. But it was the cold that anchored itself in my memory, not the sharp bite of winter air or the artificial chill of overactive cooling systems. This was different. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, as if the house had been holding something frozen at its core. I touched the doorframe as I passed through it. The wood felt normal under my fingertips, yet the sensation lingered longer than it should have. My partner called from the kitchen, his voice carrying a note I couldn't quite identify. When I joined him, he was standing before an open refrigerator, its contents arranged with mathematical precision. "Everything's fresh," he said, though his tone suggested this wasn't good news. "Milk hasn't soured, produced still crisp, like someone just finished shopping." The kitchen counters held no evidence of recent meals. No crumbs, no water spots near the sink, no lingering sense of cooking. Even the dish towels hung with museum-quality straightness. I opened several cabinets. Canned goods faced label forward in perfect rows. Spices arranged alphabetically. Nothing appeared to be missing, yet everything felt incomplete. We moved through the house systematically. Each room presented the same paradox, immaculate order combined with an inexplicable sense of absence. The bedroom contained a bed made with military precision, but when I pressed my palm to the mattress, it yielded as if it had never supported weight. The bathroom held toiletries arranged by size and function, yet the mirror reflected no water spots, no fingerprints, no evidence of daily use. It was in the living room that I found the photographs. They lined the mantelpiece in silver frames, each one depicting the same person at different stages of life. A child on a bicycle, a teenager in graduation robes, an adult standing beside various landmarks. The progression seemed natural until I looked closer. The backgrounds in each photograph were slightly wrong. Shadows fell at impossible angles. The lighting in group shots never quite matched between subjects, and in every image, no matter the setting or the company, the main subject's eyes held the same expression. Not happiness or sadness, but something more unsettling, recognition, as if they were looking directly at whoever would eventually examine these pictures. My partner had moved to the basement. His footsteps echoed through the floor, steady and methodical. I remained with the photographs, trying to understand why they affected me so deeply. The frames themselves were unremarkable, but as I lifted one to examine it more closely, I noticed something that made my skin tighten. The photograph wasn't quite seated properly in its frame. A thin edge of paper protruded from behind the visible image. I worked it free carefully, revealing a second photograph underneath. This one showed the same person, but the expression was different. Gone was that unsettling recognition, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. I checked the other frames. Each one contained multiple layers of photographs, like archaeological strata of the same life. The deeper images showed progressively more distress, as if someone had been systematically replacing happier memories with increasingly troubled ones. The final layer in each frame revealed photographs that were almost painful to look at, not because they were graphic, but because they captured a level of psychological anguish that felt invasive to witness. The basement door creaked as my partner returned upstairs. His face had taken on a grayish pallor, and when I asked what he'd found, he simply shook his head. We stood in that living room, surrounded by evidence of a life that seemed both completely documented and entirely absent. The telephone rang. The sound cut through the house's unnatural silence like a blade. We both stared at the device, an old-fashioned model with an actual bell that continued its mechanical cry. My partner reached for it first, but I caught his wrist. Something about the timing felt orchestrated. The ringing stopped. In the silence that followed, I became aware of other sounds. The ventilation system's hum had changed pitch slightly. Somewhere in the house, a door was settling into its frame with the barely audible whisper of wood against wood, and beneath it all, so faint I might have imagined it, was the sound of breathing that wasn't ours. We searched the house again, more thoroughly this time. Closets, cabinets, spaces behind furniture, nothing. Yet the sensation of being observed persisted, growing stronger as we moved through the rooms. It wasn't the feeling of hidden eyes watching us, but something more subtle. The sense that our presence was being noted, catalogued, remembered. In the study, I found a journal lying open on the desk. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical in its consistency. The entries were dated, but the dates themselves followed no logical sequence. Some were from decades past, others seemed to reference events that hadn't occurred yet. The content was equally disorienting. One entry described a conversation with a visitor who had never arrived. Another detailed the preparation of a meal that was never cooked. A third entry, written in the same careful script, simply repeated the phrase, "They know what I did," for an entire page, the repetition growing slightly less controlled with each line until the final instances trailed off into illegible scratches. My partner called me to the hallway. He was standing before a closet door that we had already checked, but now it stood slightly ajar. Inside, hanging among ordinary clothes, was a coat that neither of us remembered seeing before. It was damp with condensation, as if it had just been brought in from cold air, despite the fact that the weather outside was mild. I touched the fabric. It was real enough, but when I lifted the sleeve to examine it more closely, water droplets fell to the floor with sounds that seemed too loud for their size. The coat smelled of something I couldn't identify, not quite earth, not quite metal, but something organic that had been changed by pressure and time. The telephone rang again. This time I answered it. The line was silent but not empty. I could hear something that might have been breathing, or might have been static, or might have been the sound of air moving through spaces too small for air to move. When I spoke into the receiver, my voice seemed to travel down the line and disappear completely, as if the connection led to a place that absorbed sound rather than transmitted it. "Hello," I said again, though I knew it was pointless. The line went dead, but the silence on the other end lingered in my ear like a physical presence. I set the receiver down carefully, aware that my partner was watching me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not concern exactly, but something closer to recognition. "You've been here before," he said. It wasn't a question. I started to deny it, but the words wouldn't form. Had I been here before? The house felt familiar in ways that went deeper than the hour we'd spent examining it. The layout seemed to anticipate my movements. The sounds felt like echoes of sounds I'd heard in dreams I couldn't quite remember. We returned to the basement. The space below was larger than the house's footprint should have allowed. Concrete walls stretched beyond the reach of our flashlights, disappearing into shadows that seemed to have weight and substance. The air was colder here, but not uncomfortably so. It felt purposeful, as if the temperature had been carefully calibrated for preservation. Along one wall stood filing cabinets, their metal surfaces beaded with condensation. My partner opened the first drawer while I explored the rest of the space. Inside were folders, each one labeled with a series of numbers that followed no system I could recognize. The documents within were photocopies of police reports, medical records, newspaper clippings. All seemed to relate to disappearances, people who had simply stopped existing in the spaces they had previously occupied. But it was the photographs clipped to each file that made my chest tighten. They showed the same locations we had just examined upstairs: the kitchen, the living room, the bedroom. In each photograph, these spaces looked exactly as we had found them, but the images were clearly older. The paper had yellowed, the edges were worn. These photographs had been taken long before our arrival, yet they documented a scene that was identical to what we had just witnessed. I called my partner over, but when I turned to show him what I'd found, he was gone. His flashlight lay on the concrete floor, still illuminating the filing cabinets, but he had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. I called his name, and the sound came back to me changed, distorted by the strange acoustics of the space. I was alone in a basement that shouldn't have existed, holding evidence of a crime that hadn't been committed, in a house that felt like a stage set waiting for actors who would never arrive. The filing cabinets contained dozens of cases, hundreds of photographs, thousands of pages of documentation. All of it pointed to the same conclusion: people disappeared, leaving behind spaces that remained perfectly preserved, as if waiting for their return. The homes were always found in the same condition: undisturbed, clean, cold. And in every case, the investigating officers had filed identical reports, using the same clinical language I had used in my own documentation. Word for word, as if we were all reading from the same script. I climbed the stairs back to the main floor, but the house above had changed. The furniture was arranged differently, though I couldn't specify how. The photographs on the mantelpiece showed different faces now, but the expressions were the same, that unsettling recognition, as if they were looking directly at me across time and space. The front door was locked. I tried the windows, but they wouldn't budge. The glass felt warm under my palms, despite the house's persistent chill. When I pressed my face to the pane to look outside, I saw my own reflection staring back, but the eyes in the reflection held that same expression I'd seen in all the photographs. The telephone rang a third time. I let it ring. The sound filled the house, echoing off surfaces that seemed designed to amplify and distort it. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was so complete it felt like a presence in itself. I sat in the single chair in the entryway, the one that faced the empty space where a table might have stood. From this position, I could see through the doorway into the living room, down the hallway toward the bedroom, across to the kitchen entrance. The house revealed itself as a series of interconnected stages, each one perfectly arranged for observation. The cold was no longer uncomfortable. It felt natural, necessary, like the controlled environment of a museum designed to preserve artifacts that were too fragile for normal temperatures. I understood now why the house felt so familiar. I had been here before, not physically, but in dreams that weren't quite dreams, in memories that weren't quite memories. The documents in the basement had included my own case files, reports I had written about disappearances I had investigated. But the dates on those files were wrong. They showed cases I hadn't worked yet, in locations I had never visited, involving people I had never met. Yet the handwriting was unmistakably mine, and the conclusions were identical to thoughts I was having at this very moment. I tried to remember arriving at the house. The call had come in during the afternoon shift, but when exactly? Who had made the call? What were the names of the neighbors who reported the missing person? The details that should have been clearest were the ones that slipped away when I tried to focus on them. My partner's name escaped me entirely. I could see his face, remember his voice, recall the expression he'd worn when he asked if I'd been here before. But his name had become a blank space in my memory, as if it had been carefully excised by someone who understood exactly which details were important and which could be safely removed. The house settled around me with small sounds, wood expanding, pipes adjusting, the whisper of air moving through spaces designed for perfect circulation. I remained in the chair, facing the empty space, understanding gradually that I was no longer investigating a disappearance. I was participating in one. The realization should have triggered panic, but instead brought a sense of completion, as if I had been moving toward this moment for longer than I could remember. The house wasn't a crime scene. It was a conclusion, the end point of a process that had begun long before I walked through the front door. The photographs on the mantelpiece had changed again. Now they showed me at various stages of my life, but like the others, they were layered. Beneath each visible image were others, showing progressively more distress, more recognition, more understanding of what was happening. The final layer in each frame showed my face wearing the same expression I could feel settling over my features now. The telephone would ring again soon. When it did, someone would answer, and they would hear the same silence I had heard, the same breathing that might have been static, the same sense of communication with a place that absorbed sound rather than transmitted it. But I wouldn't be the one answering. I would be the one calling. The house had grown warmer, or perhaps I had grown colder. The distinction no longer mattered. What mattered was that the preservation process was complete, and the space was ready for its next occupant. Somewhere a call was being made. A wellness check was being requested. Officers were being dispatched to investigate a disappearance that had already occurred. The front door would be unlocked when they arrived. The entryway would be undisturbed. Surfaces would bear no dust or signs of recent activity. A single chair would face an empty space where a table might have stood, its legs perfectly aligned with the floor tiles. And the indoor temperature would register 10 degrees below the norm.